So what are you embracing, right? What you embrace is your answer. It is your intent. It is your purpose. It is your reason. These are all words that I'm going to correlate together as well, because people have used these words all throughout history, and I think they're all very important, but they all lead to the same place. What are you answering? Where is your purpose? Who are you calling to, right? Where are you looking, as I talked about in the beginning of the presentation? So what are you embracing? We are what we embrace, what we choose, we follow, we permit. And so that means that if I say I want this thing in existence, I want this natural or unnatural thing, I want to promote the natural or unnatural, okay? Accordingly, because I chose to keep that thing in existence. So I'm essentially saying it is natural to have this thing, or it is truthful to have this thing if I think this is what belongs. This is what belongs here. This is what is the answer. Okay, that's what I'm saying. I'm thinking that it's natural. It may not actually be natural, but I'm choosing it for that reason. Now again, some people might purposefully choose the wrong things, the unnatural things. But I'm hoping that you watching this has a good intention, so I'm going to assume that you would want good things, but we can get deceived and we can become dishonest. And again, that's where the problem is too. So what we choose, we follow and permit. We would want to follow and permit nature, right? So not just follow nature, because it is there and externally this macro thing that we have to understand, but we have to allow it to do its thing if it is what consists of this universe. We need to allow the answers to manifest themselves if everybody needs to understand those answers, right? We need to allow the truth to be shown. Again, as that quote we talked about earlier, all it wants is the liberty of appearing, because the truth is already there. The question is, are we going to be aggregators to bring that truth out into the public, or are we going to keep it hidden? And for what purpose would we keep it hidden? What purpose would we deceive people? What purpose would we be dishonest with people? Again, if we wanted to control them, perhaps, which we'll talk about more. Whatever you embrace, you come to know better. This is another thing worth mentioning. If you embrace a poison, you start to understand it a little bit better. Its effects, how it feels to be poisoned. And you may not like that, or you may actually build a tolerance to it. Right? But it's not necessarily something that you're supposed to build a tolerance to just because you can. Our bodies are very smart. Okay, we cannot underestimate our ancestors nor our own body, because there's so much that you'd have to take into account with our body, that it's always breathing for itself. It does these functions without us even noticing. Life is just always organizing in this such a fashion. And you got our ancestors, they didn't have access to technology. They didn't have access to a lot of the words we use. And so they may have had thoughts, but they didn't know how to articulate it. Doesn't mean they weren't smart. Just because they had different ways of doing things, we underestimate so much perhaps of the past, or so much of nature, when there's wisdom to be found everywhere. Right? Because it's this vast world that we think we know as human beings, but again, we're just merely one part of time. And nature has always been here. So when we're facing the problem, we are embracing the solution. And when we're facing the unnatural, we are embracing the natural. This is worth really importantly knowing. Is that if you want to defeat something, maybe you even have trauma in your past, the best way to face that problem, people say you have to face it, you have to go head on. Well, the best way to do that is to embrace the solution, which may be facing the problem. Facing the problem is embracing the solution, facing it head on, saying this is the problem, I'm going after it, right? I'm not letting this problem happen, I'm going to stand right here, this is where I'm drawing the line. Otherwise, where are you drawing your line, right? You'd have to draw a whole circle around me. If I'm like, well, something's going to get me, I don't know where, I'm going to have to draw a whole circle, and then that's a lot to prepare for, and I'm not always ready to be ready for that whole circle. But if I can draw a line and say this is exactly where this person is going to get me, then that is facing the problem more directly, right? And it's embracing the solution, which is self-defense, responsibility, ownership of recognizing I need to stand my ground, right? The same thing with our traumas and anything else that we're facing in this life. Maybe we're facing a disease. Embrace the solution is don't eat foods that cause the disease in the first place, right? You have to ask yourself the very thing that caused the disease and get rid of the very thing that caused the disease. And that is embracing the solution, is not having that thing that's causing the problem, or having the thing that your body needs, having a thing that creates the solution, you may say. But often, if we use the word solution or we use the word answer, that implies that there is a problem or a question to solve. And so that implies that there wouldn't need to be a solution or need to be an answer if the solutions or the answers are already present. And what do we see in nature? The answers or solutions are already present because we can simply embrace life and live our lives as we are too. Right? That is what it means to also be free and at peace and at comfort, as we talked about before. So, the solution is that embrace, but in order to get there, if we're in an unnatural world, perhaps it is to just embrace and not actually to do anything crazy and unnatural because it might be counterintuitive. This plays a big role into the action we're going to be talking about, so let's talk about this a little bit more. Wu Wei and Ziran. These are concepts in Taoism. Taoism, right, is a study, a philosophy, may you say. Some people will call it a religion. I don't care what you call it. It has roots in understanding nature. Therefore, I'm interested. It's looking at the universal. It's looking at what applies to everybody. It's looking at this essence, this way, as it is said, the Tao stands for the way, that is ever present, that maintains order. Okay, and so there's two concepts within the Tao that are talked about. Now, there's other concepts, of course, as well. But these are particularly important when we're talking about the natural and unnatural. So Wu Wei stands for the effortless, the embrace, listening, okay? And Ziran stands for self-regulating, natural, or intelligence. Okay, so effortless intelligence, effortless self-regulating, embracing intelligence, embracing self-regulation, listening intelligence, listening self-regulating. I'm combining these words together now. See, we would want, ideally, a world where it's effortless to have the solutions. And thus, there is no need for solutions because they're already present. We would want an effortless natural world because it's nature that is natural to us. So let the natural be natural by being natural, as we talked about before. This is the concept of Wu Wei and Ziran, is embracing what is nature, and that is to be natural. So listen to the natural, effortless being natural, embrace natural. I'm just connecting these words and these definitions that are on here. So you can choose to embrace nature. It's easy as it is, because nature is, truth is, it simply already is. So if you want to live with the truth or with nature, there's not much you have to do. Rather, there's less you have to do. It's inaction. And often when you look into the Tao Te Ching and a lot of the Taoist texts, you'll find out there's a lot of polarities that are being played with, so you can understand the holistic view of life, the ironies that are within the nature of this life, and even just the polarity itself between the natural and the unnatural, and how humans may try to play as God and try to do so much, and that is the very problem. Is rather they should just live their lives and have fun and do their thing. So the main message is to stop changing life and start living life. That's it. And that's what it means to have a life, is to live. And you're not living if you're always busy doing all this man-made stuff that really keeps you from living. And it actually does, because it reduces your lifespan, it increases stress, and you have all these issues that come from not living in alignment to nature, or the way, or the effortless, this self-regulating organism, which is known as the human body. Right? If the human body is able to do what it needs to do, then it's a very powerful organism. It's a very powerful machine. It's a garden, right, as we talked about before. And this is why when people go fasting, for example, they might see a lot of benefits, because what they're doing is they're cleaning out what doesn't belong, and what nature does is just restore what does belong. It's restore, it's regeneration. which all that means is bring back what was there, or bring back what is intended to be there. So your body already has the answers, you simply must work with it or manifest those answers. And all you got to do is bring it out of them. So you say, well, somebody has a conscience, somebody has natural powers. How do you get those natural powers out of them? You say, man, this cop, he has no care about the human species and no care about what he's doing to his fellow man. This politician, what have you, anybody, right? Well, let's look deeper into them. Do they have a conscience? Can we bring that out of them? Because right now they're suppressing that, they're order following, they're just doing what they're told, they're wrapped in their own ideology of I need to steal from somebody, I need to do this, right? I need to create this. But if you can get past those illusions and those barriers that are within their mind, maybe they do have a conscience. Maybe there is a point to where they would actually give love rather than hate or fear or any of the negative things we would say is the opposite of love. So it's not as simple as saying let's just love everybody, let's just give to everybody, because we also need to understand not to steal, right? And not to give way to evil. Because in order to love, in order to have nature, you have to get rid of that which is unnatural and not of nature. Here you have a quote, the price of freedom is simply choosing to be. Liberation is in the mind. And this also validates with the perspective of the principle of mentalism. It's just the fact that all is mind. And many writers have talked about how, freedom and slavery, these are mental states. And so the price of freedom is just choosing to be, and that choice, you may say, is made in the mind, right? Because the mind is this thinking machine, and where do we acquire knowledge? To the mind. Here's another quote, "We're happy if we studied nature more in natural things, and acted according to nature, whose rules are few, plain, and most reasonable." I mean, this really sums up everything we've talked about. Studied nature, that is where we have knowledge. More in natural things, so we understand what is natural, and acted according to nature, so that way we do and create what is natural, and those rules are few, plain, and most reasonable. I mean, most able in general, whether it's responsible, reasonable, because that very ability to be able is determined by the nature which allows someone to be able to have health, to heal, to do anything in this life. So, when you know and respect your inner nature, you know where you belong. You also know where you don't belong. This is another quote. Again, speaking as to the fact that if you understand your nature, you embrace the answers, you understand where you have a direction, you have a purpose and intent, maybe if you get out of bounds, and this is where experimentation also comes in, you can bring yourself back on track. You can get distracted here and there, but you can go back onto the path of alignment, or, may they say enlightenment, or what have you, if you can just understand and follow that path. You know where you're looking, you know where you're heading, your intent is true, and so you're following nature, you know where you belong, and therefore you know where you don't belong. Okay, your inner nature, notice it says that, inner nature, as if there's some sort of truth that needs to be found, or purpose that is underlying all the illusions, all the barricades. So, let's say we aren't to embrace life. Let's say, Zoran and Wu Wei and all these ancient wisdoms, or let's say it's all not supposed to be important. Well, what we would tell ourselves is that there is no need for patience and no wisdom. And so the question is, why not just live life, right? Why not just live life? Must we worry? Must we sacrifice? And so life must be lived, otherwise it isn't life, as I mentioned before. But what about this idea of worry and sacrifice, right? We see there's a lot of problems in the world. Well, if we want to be happy, you can say just be happy, but does that mean that we should worry? Because you might feel like you should worry if things are going bad. You might feel like you have to take action when, this solution seems like inaction. Well, you want to trust your nature, and you really want to get clear as to what it is you need to do. This is where patience and wisdom comes in. So instead of ignoring the Wu Wei, the Zoran, know its time and place. Know the time and place for inaction, and know the time and place for action, which similarly would work with the inaction. Because if you're working with nature and the answers are already present, then you're working with what already is. So you're sort of working inaction, action, inaction, action, nurture, nature, to make things happen in a connection, a harmony, a balance, right? And so when you have sacrifice, another idea, which also depends on some context, right? Because sacrifice might not sound good in the sense of suicide, but it would sound good in the sense of, oh, I'm doing my courage and my duty and I'm making a sacrifice, but then why are you dying? And does sacrifice imply dying? Well, not necessarily. Again, time and place and understanding more about this, having knowledge. Must we sacrifice our time and energy? Must we try to fight more of the unnatural? Using some of the unnatural in order to do so? I mean, must we sacrifice some of our nature, our natural energy to do this? I mean, I told you I'm sacrificing some of my energy to make this presentation that shouldn't really have to be made. It doesn't have to be made. I'm choosing to make that. So that is a voluntary sacrifice, one that I'm willing to make as I see it as necessary according to the time and place. Okay, but it's not one I have to make. It's not one that nature requires. It's not one that's nature's bound. That's why I said in the very beginning, you don't depend upon me, and I don't depend upon you either, however, right? And we're just fellow messengers. This can only be a fellow guide. And so you can worry, you can sacrifice, but the point is that at the end of the day, you don't want to worry too much and you don't want to sacrifice too much. You want to know time and place, and you want to be very smart with what you're doing here. And by smart, I mean be conscious. Take your time. Have wisdom. And a lot of people may not feel like they have the time or the patience to do things. And so I created a movement based around this idea of nature as the answer and understanding the knowledge of nature. So this is an optional sacrifice. This is an optional use of your energy. Again, it's not the only way, but it's one that I created to emphasize these ideas. So nature is the answer, NITA.ONE, that's the website I created, and I created a flag to help emphasize the ideas, and it's all just natural elements. You got a tree, an hourglass to represent the importance of time. You got the sun, and you've got the blue, which can be seen as the sky or the ocean, the grass, and everything's in there pretty much, but you get the point, right? All the elements, everything's connected. So I think it's important to emphasize the fact why I created this. It's to emphasize these ideas, to say, yeah, it is the answer, and we can learn from it. We can learn so much. It's not limited to just me or anybody, and this movement is you. It's part of everybody, and it's a worldwide, timeless movement that will ever persist for the main reason it's just education, nothing more, nothing less, right? It's just to get the idea that nature is the answer, because if it isn't, my question to you is, what is? And so here you have a little diagram going over, where Naturosophy and Sapientia Naturae fits in with this picture. It helps us understand that nature is the answer. And when we have that as the answer, we create unity, not just within ourselves in relation to the natural world, but with each other, because we recognize the time and place of all peoples and our relations with each other. And with that unity, we create action, right? Because we are on the same page. So our knowledge leads us to the action, which then creates the desired world that we want, one based in understanding nature, which is something that everybody has been doing for all this time. I'm simply putting on paper saying this is what humans are trying to do. They're trying to find their purpose. They're trying to find an intent within the universe. They're trying to understand nature. And so that's why I created this movement, again, which is totally optional, and I created just to emphasize the ideas. Unite, or Unit AE, however you want to see it, AE stands for the laws of nature. Right? So we're one big unit of people who are teaching the laws of nature. Another way you can look at it is NITA, NITA, and unite together as one word. Right? And so what we're doing, though, is also bringing the knowledge together. And that's how we get this philosophy to begin with. This is how we understand the importance of nature to begin with. Again, it's how we define nature and understand what is good and what is bad and all these things we talk about. So really, it's the knowledge of nature that is the answer. It's not nature itself, it's knowledge of nature, or just knowledge in general, but it would have to be knowledge of nature if it's of any relevant importance, because we don't want to distract ourselves and we don't want to be dishonest with ourselves. We want to be sure it is knowledge and not something that deceives us, something that makes us even more ignorant, right? So we need to know where our source is. And when we say there is a source in this world, what is that source? Well, it's nature itself, the only source that can be, right? Of course, other than using the word God or other words other than nature, you get where I'm pointing. You see where I'm seeing. Nature represents all these things. It represents truth, it represents reality, and I made a whole animation about this movement. If you're interested, this is the thumbnail for that video. It is actually a whiteboard animation where it goes over why join the movement and what's involved within the process. But again, it's really just education and sharing the materials. That's your sign of joining the movement. There's nothing else, you know. There's no signatures or anything required of you. It's simply you being you and showing, yes, I am me. That's it. And again, why should you have to show it? Well, because of the unnatural world. And if it works with the natural world to show it, then it's not really a big deal. It reminds us of the importance of nature, of the natural world. As long as we aren't so reliant on it, where this image and this movement becomes our identity and consumes who we are as our natural beings, then, you know, that's where it becomes a problem. But if it doesn't get to that point, you know, where people are simply just using it as a medium and as a method of aggregating the knowledge of nature, then it's not an issue, right? And besides, the truth is the truth. As long as it gets out there, I consider that a win-win, and the rest will figure out itself on its own, right? So the whole nature of anything, again, going back to these slides, I have a slide called the cycle of change. And this is very similar to that idea of nature, nurture, nature, because nurture is right in the middle. But again, that nurturing process can be naturalization or it could be denature, right? And when we are looking at this in the positive sense of naturalization, in promoting what is good, what is natural, we are nurturing, we are providing knowledge, and at the same time we're providing freedom, which all comes via nature, because that's where we're getting our knowledge, and that's where we're getting our freedom. See, I can say knowledge is important, and that's what allows us to understand nature, but nature is still there present. It's what provides us that knowledge in the first place. So nature is still above that, or below that, whatever you want to refer to. Again, you know, I can flip the pyramid on its head. The soil is more than us. The dead bodies, all the many ancestors, is more than us. This life has much more than just our own egos, our own images, our own self. And so recognizing that and recognizing all the changes in history teaches us for what change has to come. The cycle of change is just this, you know, nature to nurture to nature. And what really is our condition, our nature? It is our health. Because again, nature is just another word for health. Well, that's true. If I introduce a certain food, a certain drug, it's going to change the state of health. And that is our status, that is our condition, and that is the real quote-unquote state, right? Because state stands for condition. And so if there's going to be any state, it is simply a condition, something that is here. And so if that is our health and that is our nature, then the state is natural. It is supposed to be. That is what the state is. And it's interesting because we usually refer to government as the state, as if it is supposed to be the condition of humankind, as if it's supposed to be this natural condition of humankind. But it isn't. The same way they use the word naturalization, as if it's natural to be born in a certain country or government, when it isn't, because it's all man-made stuff anyways. See, your health, your body, your mind, your freedom is not bound to another man, it's bound to nature. And that's what gives you your human nature. That's where you identify human rights or natural rights. So, correct for the correct. In chiropractic medicine or any form of medicine, you have to correct the spine, right? To make sure it's correct. You got to put it in place. Correct it for the correct. The same way we would use nature for nature, right? In the case of naturalizing for nature, right? So, nature for nature, correct for the correct. That's what we're doing. We're using the truth for the truth. We're using our nature for nature. And here is the method that I developed, just again, optional, you don't have to use it, to identify the whole nature of any one thing. And this is basically the end of these types of slides that I created a while back. But this goes over what identifies the whole nature of anything, and we'll have an example. So the simple nature is the intended use or function, and the base nature is the requirements, the core nature is what it's made of, and the second nature is the impacts or effects. Okay? Now the second nature is technically also the second simple nature. All right? And I want you to really look at this chart so you can look at it for yourself and see why I chose each one. Right? Now, of course, these are just words, but you have to understand what the context is thereof. That's the whole point of identifying the whole nature of something, is to understand what it means, what it intends to do, its knowledge, right? Which is not limited to just certain words. As anything, not general nature can be the type or form, and the higher nature is the greater simple nature. So, in case this looks a little confusing, I'm going to provide a example. If we are to look at natural law, right? Natural law, the topic we talked about before, if we are going to identify, well, what is the intended use or function of natural law? Well, we use it for morality in the case of the natural moral law, right? This is the context I'm using here. For natural moral law, what we use it for is for morality, or you may say for kindness, for compassion, for empathy, right? For conscience, and whatever, right? Now, what is it from? What's the requirements? Well, how do we attain morality? Well, we need to have reason. We need to have conscience. We need to have something that brings us there. What is the requirements? Now, another thing you might say is the requirements is what it's made of, but that's the other question. That's the core nature. So what is natural law made of? It's made of effects. That's how we utilize our reason to understand morality. Okay, so requirements and what it's made of can be two separate things, because just because something is made of something does not mean that's what's required, okay, for that thing. It is definitely a requirement, that's what makes it its nature, but there might be other requirements involved, and in this case there's reason, there's the human input. So there's effects within the universe, but there's a human input to interpret those effects and then use it for something, which is morality, right? Which you can say is this purpose that we're using natural law for. So we have it there. The purpose is for morality. That's our answer. This is why, when we talk about a world that does not have much morality, when we might say natural law is the answer. It's something that we need because it is what is the intended use, the function of natural law. Now, what about the second nature? The second nature is the impacts or effects. So what are the impacts of natural law? What are the effects of having natural law? Well, it can be the nature of behavior and perception, right? And it could be chaos and order, how things manifest, right? That is what comes of it, and those would have to be separate natures you'd have to observe. Okay, so we'd have to break down, well, what is the nature of behavior? What is the nature of perception? And we might actually notice there's common relationships with those natures in natural law itself, because they were mentioned within their own definitions. So what I mean by that is, by looking at natural law and breaking it down and saying what consists of this nature, you're going to find other natures that you have to also separately identify, and you're going to see common relationships between these. Now, of course, this is all dependent on the knowledge that you have, but it makes you question more, which is how you obtain knowledge in the first place. And that's the whole goal of this methodology, is just to get you to question more. So what is the general nature, or the type or form of natural law? Well, it's a phenomenon, right? It's a law. So you can say whatever you think it is. I'm going to say it's a phenomenon, right? A higher nature. Well, what makes it greater? What are we using morality for? So now we're looking at morality. Why? Why morality? Well, it's for a better world. So that's the greater simple nature, okay? Now, maybe I can choose a different example, like an apple, right? I use an apple as the example in my second book. And again, you're not limited as to what words you want to choose, as long as it makes sense when you validate through and you look at this and it forms the sentence. Natural law for morality from reason of effects can be the nature of behavior and perception, a phenomenon for a better world. See, it's a sentence that you create. Well, what if we look at an apple, right? I'm going to use it for enjoyment, for satiation, for nutrition, right? What are the requirements? Well, eating, right? I need to eat. I need to eat that apple. I need to grow it. Now, what is it made of? It's made of sugars and fibers, right? Fibers and sugars and different nutrients, right? That can be really beneficial to us. Maybe some electrolytes, and a lot of other compounds, perhaps. Now, it can be the nature of what? So what are the impacts or the effects of eating apples? Well, glycemic index, in the case of it being sugar. In the case of what our other answers have talked about, could be hydration, right? It can be satiation. It can be fulfillment, nutrition. It could be other simple natures, as we talked about, the second simple natures. So other uses or functions. Now, what is the general nature? Well, it's a fruit, right? An apple is a fruit. It's something that we identify and say, this is a plant. It is a plant that grows on a tree. It's blah, 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 right? That is what makes it its general nature. And the higher nature, well, why? What's a greater form of nutrition? Well, it's for a healthier body. It's for a healthier world. It's a greater form of what we talked about where we said it's for nutrition. So now it's for a healthy body. It's for health. So you can do this with anything that you identify, and you can use this method to help yourself understand what is the whole nature of anything. So let's look at one that is very important that we talked about a little bit before. Slavery. Now, this is a topic that has plagued humanity for thousands of years. And it is one that I particularly talk about a lot because my first book is called Slavery Gone for Good. And the reason why it's important to look at slavery is, well, if we look at the previous topics we looked at, they deal with the idea that nature is this answer or is this authority, and that's how we respect nature, that's how we understand it. And so if we don't have our respect there and our authority is not there, we don't seek to understand it, and we're disregarding it and we're putting it in the lack, in the back burner, what is the effect of that ultimately? And so let's just first break down slavery and see if there's any connections to be made here. Is slavery unnatural? Well, there's a reason perhaps why humanity has gotten rid of it and why nobody will try it today. Why people see it as immoral and therefore unnatural. Let's look at some definitions by some abolitionists who lived in the time, the 1800s. Slavery is voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary when one sells or yields his or her own person to the irresponsible will of another. Involuntary when placed under the absolute power of another without one's own consent. So that is saying that slavery can be voluntary or involuntary, right? Slavery, a lot of people think, is just ball and chain slavery, but here you hear it from an abolitionist himself from that time period where we say slavery was abolished, where he's saying it's more than just that. It is understanding that no person belongs to another, and here you have another definition that goes alongside that by Henry Clark Wright, where he says slavery is submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. Okay, so that's not saying specifically, oh, you chain this person up and you call them this and call them that and make sure they go on the plantation and they get unpaid labor, right? It's saying specifically submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. And here you have another definition. This one's from a professor. He states slavery is theft. Theft of a life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce, theft even of the children a slave might have born, right? Because if you were born in a slave family, you would naturally be a slave, right? You're born into that slave family, well, now you're a slave because you were born in that family. And so it sort of made life seem very natural to the slaves to be a slave, and it was natural to the slave owners to have slaves because everybody else did it, and because everybody saw it as necessary for the economy or necessary for the world, and therefore they saw it as morally justifiable, or they saw it as natural to have within society. But what is slavery? Slavery is the claim of ownership over the life or property of another. So if we were to apply truth or nature to this, do I own you? Can I claim ownership over the life or property of you? And a lot of people, if I ask this question to them, would say, no, you do not. I own that for myself, truthfully, because I earned it, I've had it. Duration, labor, all the things we talked about before, what defines natural property, what defines natural rights. It's this idea that, this authority cannot be in man, but in ourselves and in nature, because we ourselves are part of nature. So we have a connectivity and a role and a time and place to understand within nature, and the fact that we are not God. We can't determine for other people what their rights are and tell them how to live their life. Well, what is slavery? It's telling people how to live their life and saying these are your rights. This is what you can or cannot do with your own nature. It's limiting their natural powers, limiting anything natural that an individual can do with their natural body. Because you're claiming ownership over that body, over that individual's own life. And life is just another word for nature, right? So they can't live their life because they're being told what to do. And so there goes the idea of Wu Wei and Zoran, the slave masters constantly imposing their conditions upon the slave, and the slave has no choice but to go with it. The only thing that they're doing is just embracing man's authority, but they're not embracing the natural, they're not embracing nature. So they may have the Wu Wei aspect of just let things go, but they're not embracing what needs to be embraced. And therefore you see conflicts occur, and you see a lot of unnatural scenarios occur. And that is what you see with slavery. And so a lot of questions should come from this. A lot of questions, when you see this and you look at these definitions, you should be asking yourself a lot of questions like, how did we get there? How come slavery has existed for thousands of years and nobody got rid of it, and some people got rid of it in the 1800s? And what if there's other forms of slavery? And how come we can't define slavery nowadays? I would hope that you're asking those questions, because to me, that is really, really important. Slavery, then, is unnatural doing, because all wrongdoings are forms of slavery. If you are saying, I can steal from you, I can do violence to you, you're claiming their property, you can do whatever you want to them. You're claiming to do something against their will, something that they don't want happening to them. So all wrongdoings, as they are all forms of theft, all forms of violence, they're also all forms of slavery. And slavery is not natural because no one is born out of the womb with chains attached to them, right? Some people may get them on a birth certificate and say they're naturalized into some sort of system, or that they have to obey and pay some sort of tax. But does nature ask that of you? Did nature ever ask that of you? See, slavery is not a necessary evil as everybody thought it was back then, and nobody is by nature a slave. And that's why, as we talked about before with natural morality, Frederick Douglass proved the fact that he is not a slave by nature. See, he is not a slave because truthfully he owns himself, and truthfully you own yourself, and he would do no wrong by leaving you be you and leaving himself be himself. He's embracing his state, you're embracing your state, nobody's interfering with each other. And if we want to, talk to each other and correspond with each other, then our answers are aligned, our time and place is met. We are aligned to each other. We are not, pushing one down to get ourselves higher. We're not doing anything like that. We are basically working in harmony. We are working with the natures that be. And that is essentially what it means to free ourselves from slavery in this case, because we're recognizing that there's freedoms that nature provides for us, that slavery is a man-made imposed condition that occurred because people believed that they should. People believed that they should be enslaved, or that others should be enslaved. So it's necessary then to talk about the mind and the brain, because if there's a belief present that some people think, hey, this person should be a slave and this person shouldn't, there's a belief involved. Now you say, well, Cory, we're talking about slavery, how is this relevant to this day? Remember I asked that question before, though. Are there other forms of slavery? So let's talk about these different forms of slavery. I'm actually going to tell you that of all the forms of slavery you might be able to identify in your life based on the definitions we talked about, they can be deduced to these two forms of slavery: mental slavery and physical slavery. Okay? And I want you to ask yourself also which one you think is more dangerous. Okay? And you might say it's physical slavery, but it might actually be mental slavery. So, mental slavery is self-imposed obedience or statism to man-made authority. Quote-unquote authority, again, because man does not have an innate authority by nature. They have to make that by a belief system. They have to say, I have more rights than you, I can own this, that you can't own, I can own you, and you can't own yourself. It's an authority that is man-made, man-imposed. Okay, but physical slavery is violently imposed obedience or statism to man-made authority. So, take for example, there's this slave on this plantation, right? He thinks that he should be a slave. That is mental slavery. But what's probably keeping him in his mental slavery is also the fact that he knows if he leaves the plantation, someone's going to be there to get him, whether it's the slave patrol, or his own master, whipping him and punishing him and saying, get back on the plantation. Violence is used to keep the slave in compliance. Fear is used as a tactic to keep the person in their slavery. So, it keeps an individual in their mental slavery. The physical slavery contributes to the mental slavery. And if the slave really, just succumbs to their condition and thinks, I'm meant to be a slave and I don't want to fight this and, I have no chance of fighting this, then they succumb to their mental slavery, and that leads them to constant physical slavery, which is what they're under, right? They're under physical slavery having to do that work. And they're under even more physical slavery when they're getting whipped if they don't do that work. But either way, they're enslaved, right? And so it's important to understand that somebody can believe that they should be a slave, and somebody could also be violently imposed into being a slave. They are both equally as bad as each other, and they both contribute to each other. But what mental slavery is self-imposed denaturing, and physical slavery is violently imposed denaturing. So, that is something we need to understand. If slavery is an unnatural condition, something that's not natural for any human being because it's also immoral, because these things relate, then mental slavery is saying, well, it's okay, this wrongdoing, this unnatural thing is okay, and therefore I can give way to denaturing, I can give way to the unnatural. And physical slavery says, well, you have to go to the unnatural, you have to be denatured, okay? And that's essentially physical slavery, It's brute force. It's overt. We'll talk about that. Mental slavery is also internal. It's the belief that physical slavery is at all in any way legitimate. Okay? So notice mental slavery gives way to physical slavery, but it believes that physical slavery is in any way at all legitimate. Now again, this belief is also considered, order following or statism. Okay? Now, physical slavery is external, okay, because somebody is forcing you with violence, saying you have to comply. You're not telling yourself you have to comply. You tell yourself after the fact, after somebody says you have to comply, right? So, physical slavery can come in the form of human government, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, forced marriage, just for some examples, right? And these are some of the main examples of slavery in today's world, modern slavery. And you see human government is up there. Well, think about it. Government. What is government? It's human-made, it's man-made. It's not something that is natural, because humans are in control of it. Humans made it, right? We feel like we need it. We feel like it's natural. But is government actually on the side of physical slavery? Well, people believe in it, so there's some mental attachment to it. And what does the word statism mean? Statism, quite literally, is stateism, creating the state, which we call government. So we need to break that down more. Let's look at some of these quotes, mental slavery and physical slavery, and why these two relate. Quote, if I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have freed thousands more. It is demonstrated that to capture a man, it is not sufficient to enslave his body, it is necessary to enlist his reason. That to free a man, it is not enough to strike the shackles from his limbs. His mind must be liberated from bondage to his own ignorance. So to his own unnatural condition, he needs to be liberated from his unnatural condition into the more natural condition. He needs to seek the answer, the reason, the intent, the purpose, nature, right? Another quote, if a slave can be convinced that he should be a slave, that his enslavement is both proper and legitimate, that he is the rightful property of his master, and he has an obligation to produce as much as possible for his master, then he does not need to be physically oppressed. In other words, enslaving the mind makes enslaving the body unnecessary. And again, this goes into the idea, again, of the principle of mentalism. The fact that all is mind and all is created in the mind. We talked about the Hermetic principle. We talked about how the mind is really important. We talked about how knowledge is really important. Well, can you really have knowledge if your mind is enslaved? If you're being mind controlled? Okay, and when I put that human government on there, we're going to look more into this because, well, people are in fear of disobeying their governments, are they not? And governments use violence as the tactic to keep people in compliance against their own will. So, can this relate at all to slavery? And, well, governments and slavery, how far do they go back in history, right? So, here's another quote, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. None but ourselves, right? Because again, our nature belongs with us. It relies on us. Use nature for nature. Here's another quote, true freedom is impossible without a mind made free by discipline. That's where the temperance comes in. That's where time and place comes in. To understand where freedom belongs. And again, he says true freedom, natural freedom. Because freedom, in the true sense, means it's truthful. Freedom that belongs naturally. And it's impossible without a mind made free by discipline. Temperance is necessary for justice, essentially. Here you have another quote, as long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom and a firm sense of self-esteem is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. By Martin Luther King Jr. And some of these other quotes, Bob Marley, Larkin Rose, Mortimer Adler, Manly P. Hall, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's a former slave and abolitionist, right? Here's another quote, the cultures of earth teach you to accept, to yield, and to obey. The end of evil is found in refusing the slavery of the mind. Of the mind. He didn't just end the sentence at refusing the slavery, he said slavery of the mind in particular. That was by Jeremy Locke, an author. Now, here is another quote. I did not know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted. So that's sort of the physical slavery, instilling in the slave this mental slavery, the fact that they should be a slave. That's by Frederick Douglass, again, former slave and abolitionist. Here you have another quote, Mahatma Gandhi, how can one be compelled to accept slavery? I simply refuse to do the master's bidding. He may torture me, break my bones to atoms, and even kill me. He will then have my dead body, not my obedience. Ultimately, therefore, it is I who am the victor, and not he, for he has failed in getting me to do what he wanted done. See, somebody can take away your physical body, but they cannot take away your mind, your soul. That is something that you have, okay? And something nobody can take from you but you. And again, that's why mental slavery is so important. Because if you can convince yourself that you're free and that you by nature are free, then who's going to take that from you, right? They'd have to violently impose that upon you. And even then, do they still have you? Your mind is only your mind, right? They can try so hard to brainwash you, and there's many methods now that they're trying to control people's minds in the world. So many different people are experimenting with these things. I mean, that within itself is not a natural experiment, right? But nonetheless, when it happens, well, how strong will you be able to resist it? How much can we prevent that, right? That depends on your mind, your will, your willpower, your strength, your courage, your tolerance, all this stuff. Here's another quote, just as to establish slavery, it was necessary to do violence to nature, so it was necessary to alter nature, to perpetuate such a right. Okay, so what he's saying here, and this is a philosopher, it's really well known, He's saying that in order to establish slavery, you have to do violence to nature, but not just violence, not just physical slavery, but you have to alter nature itself. You have to change the real works, the entire deal. You have to denature everything from the core up, all the way. Make the whole system work this way, so that way slavery is seen by everyone as legitimate. So that way everybody is just normal and thinks slavery is meant to exist, right? It's part of life. It's part of nature. It's a necessary evil. Because people don't want to confront the evil. If they recognize it's an evil, then it doesn't belong. Since when is there a necessary evil? It's nonsense. Freedom from servitude comes not from violent action, but from the refusal to serve. See? Refusal, that's in the mind. Okay, so when you free yourself from servitude, it's not necessarily from defending your rights. It's first understanding that you need to defend your rights. That's a mental process that comes first and foremost. Here's another quote. The cause of the bad conditions and of the existing slavery lies in the violence used by governments. There is only one way to abolish governmental violence, that people should abstain from participating in violence. And that's a quote from the great Leo Tolstoy again. He's actually known as one of the greatest writers of all time. The quote we talked about before was Etienne de la Boétie, who is a French writer who has a great writing on the discourse of voluntary servitude. And here's another quote from Leo Tolstoy. The cause of slavery is legislation. Legislation rests on organized violence. Well, what is legislation? Wait a second. Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers of all time, telling us about legislation and organized violence. What is every law backed by? It's backed by violence. The slave begins by demanding justice and ends by wanting to wear a crown. I think this is a good way of putting it, you know? Anyone given the chance to have power, these are other quotes too. People talk about the nature of power and how it corrupts people. Tolkien talks about the nature of power and the ring, this greed and attachment to that ring. You can't get rid of it out of your life, out of your mind. You always want to hold on to it. And I did a whole presentation about that. But the slave begins by demanding justice, and they demand it. That's the very first problem. They demand justice, but they end with wanting to wear the crown. Because they should understand that you cannot demand for justice. You cannot beg to be free. You can't beg the master and say, could you please be nicer to me? You need to free yourself. You can try to make your conditions better, and you can, possibly. And you can go to another plantation where it is better. But are you still going to be a slave? Yes. And this idea of, well, if you still have it in you, this belief that there needs to be somebody in control of others, you know, and there needs to be the slave-master dynamic, then you will still create that dynamic. Even if you manage to make things better, or you manage to turn things on its head, it will just come back again because everybody believes in having that slave-master dynamic. So you can say, all right, let's stop it. No more slave-master, no more slave. But if they still believe that they should have slave-masters and slaves, whether it's the slave or the slave-master, and they're still doing the means to which to acquire that, then it's just going to happen again. It's just going to happen again because people believe in it, because people think that it's legitimate and necessary to have slavery. And so it's important to note that hypocrisy that happens. And here you have another quote, little men, whether by instinct or internal prompting, will always pursue wealth and power at the expense of their better nature. Better nature. What does that mean? That the nature that they could achieve, their truer nature, may you say. Better, gooder, right? More natural nature. And so instead of becoming more natural, little men will pursue wealth and power at the expense, and therefore toward the unnatural, toward the denaturing. And this is what happens, you know, with insecurity. You want power over others because to fill this void that you have in your life, you want to manipulate others, and it makes you feel better, a little bit more security. But you're not actually happy, and so you have to take it out on your slave, you know, the slave master who you know, deals with this scenario and actually becomes abusive with their slaves, you know, because they're so used to it, and it helps them feel better. It takes out their anger. They take it out on their own slave, their own family, what have you. So again, the importance of temperance, the importance of having a strong will, not letting instincts take us over, and understanding that insecurity can lead us to wanting power in artificial things. Because we're not secure with who we are, how could we be at comfort? How could we be at peace? How could we be present and embrace the natural world? Well, we can't if we're always insecure and feel like, well, we have to go everywhere and always at a rush and nothing's ever right and nature is just imperfect, so we have to perfect everything with man's creation. Something to definitely keep in mind. So let's talk about this now. With the Leo Tolstoy quote and what I talked about before, human government being backed by violence, as every government has been in history and ever will be, people try to claim and say, well, governments can protect the rights of people. Have they ever? Will they ever? What's required for that? And I'm sure you're going to have to input your opinion somewhere. You're going to have to input your will. And how are you going to get those things done without violence? See, government is violence. It's a monopoly on violence. A lot of people call it that. And so if we look at the act of slavery, it's momentary violence. It's any wrong action. It's the criminal. But what is the condition of slavery? Maybe many criminals. Criminals are justified. It's the continual act of slavery, where the act is happening over and over again. Nobody's fixing it, because everybody maybe either sees it as legitimate or they're letting it happen. The slaves on the plantation are letting the slave masters whip them because they have no way to retaliate, or they think because they have to be whipped, there's nothing else that could be done. And so what you have, the continual act of slavery, is any government. Okay, because it legitimizes any wrong action and it allows it to be aggregated in the whole sense. Now, you probably don't understand this if you've never looked into this perspective before. But let us first start with the first premise I made. Let's look at the criminal versus quote-unquote authority. Something is wrong here, okay? The criminal does wrong and leaves, and everyone sees it as immoral. Authority, whether it's cops, politicians, right? The politicians give the orders to the cops just follow orders, suppress their own conscience. Authority, they'll do wrong, and it continues, and everyone sees it as moral. That's the big difference, okay? Let's talk about one example that is used in governments. Okay, so let's look at the criminal first. Hey, I'm going to take some money from you. I'm going to steal it, all right? This is the criminal. Takes your money, gone. All right? Gone forever, possibly, right? They got what they wanted, right? Now, if they think that you're a vulnerable target and they've got you in a vulnerable state, they can probably take more from you. Well, let's look at what authority does. They have you in a vulnerable state because everybody else, they say, is paying their taxes and everybody's paying their fair share and it's for the common good and for the greater good, and therefore you need your money to go to the government. But what if you don't want your money to go toward the government? What if you don't want your money to be taken from these people you barely know, or for these agendas for other people and what they want? Is that fair for you, for your own property to be taken against your will? It is not fair. And so authority will do it over and over again, take your money, because everybody sees it as moral, and they change the word theft with taxation. So it turns into a whole separate thing somehow, even though it's the same exact action as theft, because you're taking someone's money that belongs with them. It's something they earn, something they work for, something they have. And they say, no, we have the authority, and if you don't pay these taxes, well, we're going to have to get this armed gang, essentially, of people who can enforce this law that we also created to carry out this issue, right? And throw you in a cage, right? So they back what they want done by violence. Anything people want done by government, they're essentially asking for their will to be done upon the rest of the population, backing it by violence. And nobody in politics is willing to say, yes, I want violence with every issue they say they want in the world. I want to provide money for this and this, and if we have this tax, we'll have this and this. Well, do you realize that's literally asking for violence? What they're literally saying is, I want violence to prevent violence, or I want violence to make certain people better. So let's take from these people and make these people better. We're just redistributing things and making it sound well. Meanwhile, I'm getting a paycheck, this politician, stealing money from people. And people forget that part. They forget the part that politicians are actually making an income, stealing money from other people, but they're not producing anything, and half the time they're giving everybody headaches with the news and all the politics and all the debates that are going on TV and on the media. So there's a big difference here. Again, we have an unnatural problem. It's an unnatural problem because it's out of control. And it's one that a lot of people may not recognize because it's so ever present, and they feel like it is out of their control. How can I control the government and the politicians and what they're doing? You know, we use the word they as if there's somebody else, but yet then we say we the government and we're the government. Do you ever question the contradictions that are brought upon this world? Because again, these contradictions prove that we are in contradiction to nature itself. There is one wrong, and that is slavery. We talked about how all the other wrongs are forms of slavery. Well, guess what? Slavery is the one wrong. And the reason why it is really wrong, not just the one wrong, okay, it's really wrong, is because it's the wrong that allows all the other wrongs. If you are vulnerable, if you are a slave, you can be stolen from, you can be murdered, you can be assaulted, the list goes on. All the crimes are available, and every single one of them is seen as legitimate or able to be done. The slave master can do any one of those things to their slave because it's their property. It's their property, so they can do anything they want with it. But is that so? Is that true? Is that truthful? No, it isn't. That person does not belong to you. You can't steal something that belongs to them. But people believe that they can. And so you are essentially, when you believe in government or believe in slavery, you are allowing a wrong that allows all the other wrongs. And you're allowing essentially the one wrong, which is slavery itself. Again, slavery is all the forms of wrong, and it's also the wrong that allows all the other wrongs. A violated individual is a vulnerable individual. It's an individual who cannot control themselves, and therefore, because they cannot control themselves, everything can take control of them. And this is why responsibility and learning to control yourself is important in today's world, because if you don't want to be a slave, and you want to be in control of what's happening in your world, the first thing you need to do is what? Become conscious, obtain knowledge. The slaves did not know how to read or write. So how do you think they get any knowledge? And we talked about how important knowledge is this entire presentation. Well, here it comes down to a real-world event that has happened for thousands of years unnoticed. And all it took was some people to say, wow, that's morally wrong. And now it's gone and everybody recognizes it's wrong. But that took a strong educational effort. Okay, it's not because some law or some piece of paper said it's wrong. It's because it is wrong. I can't believe that people actually think pieces of paper can change morality. No, it can't. Morality is a natural subject. Nature is nature. Pieces of paper can't change morality. It can't change nature. So what is abolitionism? It's the act of abolishing slavery. So when I referred to those people we talked about before, the quotes, a lot of them were abolitionists from the 1800s who were abolishing chattel slavery, one form of slavery. Okay, now what about other forms? So here is a diagram that proves then versus now. What slavery was being tackled then and what slavery is being tackled now. So then, the abolitionism then, the slavery then, okay, was chattel slavery. So we were abolishing chattel slavery in the 1800s, which is one form of systemic slavery. It's overt slavery. You can see somebody in chains. You can see that they're being coerced against their will. It's outright ownership of another human being. Okay? Well, what about now? Okay? What about now? We're abolishing political slavery, which is any systemic slavery. Now, we're going to talk about why that is, but let's first go over this quote. The number of slaves, instead of having been diminished by the war, has been greatly increased. For a man thus subjected to a government that he does not want is a slave. And this is a quote by Lysander Spooner, who was an influential abolitionist back in the time of the 1800s. We don't learn about him in schools. I wonder why. Look at this quote from Lysander Spooner and tell me your thoughts about modern abolitionism. The idea that slavery still exists now and that we need to do something about it. So, the pretense that the abolition of slavery was either a motive or justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of maintaining the national honor. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword, like the one we have now, was ever capable of maintaining slavery? So what he's saying there is that government is basically connected to the idea of slavery. And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying the political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both white and black. And yet, these impostors now cry out they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to preserve. So what he's saying is that there's other forms of slavery that they were actually preserving, and that's why they partook in this war, right? Is to make themselves seem like this moral victor. Here's the government stepping in for the people, for the abolitionists, here to abolish slavery. And meanwhile, right after, you have all these documents being signed, they change the definitions of words, they have this birth certificate scam that's going on, they have taxation being introduced to the public, they have new forms of slavery being introduced, because chattel slavery was used since the foundations of government, and we can prove it. And even if you can't prove it by the history, what about the action itself? Look at our definitions from before, right? Talking about what slavery is, and relate that to how law operates and how it's enforced. And he says, they're fighting for these other forms of slavery and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it ever was before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree between the slavery they boast to have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery and differ from each other only in degree. So, he's saying slavery is something that is basically the restriction of freedom. And I will refer it often as the complete opposite condition of freedom. You got nature, and then you got slavery, which is this man-made imposed condition. It's all purely man-made. Man's authority versus natural authority. So, if we're going to talk about statism is the belief in the state. It's the belief in government, the belief that somebody has the authority over your life and property other than you. So it's essentially the belief in slavery. In 1861, people thought it's my right to force other people to work in my fields. And now, 2012, or these years making this video, it's my right to force other people to pay for what I want. It's the same exact concept, then and now. Here's another example. The abolitionists of the past were under no obligation to explain how society would work without slavery. Well, the abolitionists of the present are under no such obligation either, both of which understand that slavery is wrong and has to end. It has to end. Evil has to end. The unnatural cannot persist. The natural must persist, right? And so, the truth must persist. The truth always shows itself by time, and this is why it was inevitable for people to recognize natural rights, for people to recognize natural law, for people to recognize their freedom, to recognize that slavery is wrong and unnatural, because the two are correlated, one and the same. So what is covert slavery versus overt slavery? Covert slavery is slavery by another name. It's overt slavery covered by deception through mental slavery, with justifications like laws, taxation, authority, and following orders. Well, I was just following orders, meanwhile carrying out the deaths of millions of people, like in the case of World War II, right? And so that's a justification. Oh, well, I was told to do it. That doesn't make it right. It's still wrong. You were the one who carried it out. That's even worse because you complied. You made it happen. Right? Someone tells you to jump off a cliff. Are you going to jump off a cliff? No, you're not. Because you're smarter. You have knowledge. You know it's going to hurt you. You know it's not something you should do. But if you turn off your brain and your ignorance and you say, man, well, who cares? I'm going to do what I'm told. Then, hey, you're going to ignore your natural nature. You're going to ignore what's natural to you. You're going to hurt yourself and end up in a condition that is not natural for you to be in. And so, if we're talking about covert slavery, it's slavery that is hard to detect because it's wrapped in illusions, wrapped in deception. And it's through mental slavery because you believe you're meant to be a slave. You think, yeah, it's justified. And you may not even know you're a slave, right? Because you think it's just part of life. You think it's natural. So why even call it slavery? It's just life. It's just the way things are, right? And so here's the question I have to ask you about covert slavery. If stealing 100% of the product of someone's labor is slavery, at what percentage is it not slavery? All right? And the only answer to this question is 0. That's the only time it's not slavery, because by definition, if it's any slavery at all, it's slavery. Okay, so if somebody says, oh, I want to take 20% of your income. Well, actually, no, it would be like 10% of your income. It's your income. That's it. End of story. It's theft. If you don't want that income being stolen from you, then it's yours, right? And you recognize that that's theft because it's against your will. Now, let's say you're convinced that you should. Well, should you really? You know? Do you really know where you're putting that money? Again, the importance of knowledge. Overt slavery, right? And you can enslave yourself, again, through mental slavery. It can lead to physical slavery, as Martin Luther King Jr. and many of the other quotes said. So you got to be very careful of what you consent to, right? What contracts you put yourself into. And this is another reason why knowledge is important. Again, it's like, what unnatural things do you put in your life? You don't always recognize it until you actually feel the effects or understand the truth by time. So overt slavery is slavery as is. It's blatant. It's physical slavery. Overt slavery is, having the slave master, the external owner, right? Just outright, I'm your owner, I'm your master. Nowadays, we might say it's a president, it's a minister, it's an official, it's a representative, it's a politician, whatever. And we have all these different terms, and we changed it over time, and it changed the public perception because people believed it. And so what you have with overt slavery is also tyrannical government, because it's overt. You can see now it's slavery. You can see that government is not so much covert, it's more overt. And so domestic servitude, sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, forced marriage. Again, all forms of physical slavery, also overt slavery. And so if stealing 100% of the product of someone's labor is slavery, it is most overt. Okay, it's not covert. It's most overt because it's 100%. Everything's being taken from you, right? So what about applying this to the sense of government? Well, covert slavery would be government seemingly less tyrannical, and overt slavery would be government seemingly more tyrannical. But there still is slavery. There still is tyranny because you see it, and it grows if you allow any of it. So people wonder, why is the world the way it is? Why is government so tyrannical? Well, it happens as the result of people letting it happen. People unaware of it happening, or people actively saying, yeah, it should happen, through their belief, through their statism. And that statism is a mentality which can be harder to address because it's not physical. You don't see somebody in chains. And in government, you may not see people in chains. But mentally they are. If they feel like they have to pay something to someone else, they have to. They feel like it's an obligation. If they don't, they're going to be coerced. They're going to be violently coerced against their will. So because of that threat of slavery, they enslave themselves. And so what you have is a covert slavery where you don't see slavery outright like you did in the past, but it's still slavery, and people are still mentally enslaved, equally so as physically enslaved, just in different ways. And people don't realize this because they never ask themselves, what is the definition of slavery? How do people become enslaved? Government war, government jailing systems, restriction of movement, restriction of ownership of property, right? There's historical accounts, and you can look at the abolitionists back then. They were also talking about this. So let's sum up some of the things we talked about so far. Slavery, the claim of ownership over the life or property of another, right? Mental to physical, action to condition. Covert to overt. Statism to government, right? Because government is this condition that we get as the result of statism, our belief that it should exist. The same way physical slavery is the result condition of our mental slavery, believing that physical slavery is legitimate. And condition, right? Well, if we all commit the same actions or allow the certain actions, then it's going to contribute to a condition. And covert to overt, same deal. The covert becomes more overt, the more it's allowed, and it becomes less less covert, and becomes more overt. So, unnatural or wrong actions are guaranteed and repeated. That's what slavery is. It's guaranteeing unnatural or wrong actions because people have a sense of legitimacy with it. They don't just see it as wrong and say, that is wrong, it's a gang of people, they're enforcing their beliefs. They think it's actually moral, and that's what makes the biggest difference between a criminal and a government, and which is why, if you can shatter that belief system, it won't exist ever again. But that belief system has to first be shattered. And so that's what happened with chattel slavery. People realized this is wrong, right? So let's just get rid of it. Let's abolish it. Hence the word abolitionism. They didn't say, let's, do it gradually over time in different forms, blah, blah, blah. No, they said, end it now. That's it. Immoral, gone. Goodbye, right? Because they realize it is unnatural, it is wrong, and there should be no exceptions to that truth that they found. And so here is another truth that we have to understand. It's the fact that government is slavery. And if you don't think that, well, I want you to look at this slide and really read through it. I'm going to read it for you. I want to break this down. Government, from Latin verb govano, or governere, means to control, plus the Latin noun mens, or mentis, means mind. So to control the mind. Now, maybe you say, oh, that's just etymology, right? Because again, that's fine. If you don't want to like the word definitions and me breaking down words, whatever floats your boat. But that is awfully kind of strange, wouldn't you say? Let's look at more of what I have to say about this. Government is slavery because it's people imposing their will on other people. Okay, so government is made up of people, but it's made up of certain actions. That's what makes it a government, right? In slavery, it's an action. It's what makes it slavery. And again, you can't be a slave to nature because that negates the idea of slavery. Slavery is a man-made condition. If you're a slave to nature, you're not a slave. You kind of just have to live with it. It's just reality, right? So, mental slavery, which is statism, is the worst form of slavery, leading to physical slavery. Okay, so again, we talked about the action to the condition, mental to physical, right? Covert to overt. The question is, did you actually consent as well? Did you consent to the government? When you were born, you were naturalized into their government, as if it's natural to be in their government. Did you actually consent? Did you, contractually say, yeah, I'm here on this land and I'm meant to pay 30% of my income to these people which they can decide how much money they want to take from me and whatever they want to do with my money. Did you consent to any of that? Because if you did not consent, well, what about our definitions of slavery before? Subjection, control of the will of another human being. Your will, your ability to choose what you want to do with your own life and your own property, if that's being told of you what to do by other people, are you really free? The answer is you're not. And if you give way to the fact that, well, I'll let this go, I'll let this pass, what will happen if everybody just lets that go and lets it pass? Then it will just keep happening over and over again. And people will get away with more and more until people realize, oh shoot, well, we got to do something about it. And now what do we do? Because we're enslaved. That's where we are now. We're like, man, we're enslaved so much. What could we do? Well, it would have helped to prevent the problem in the first place and not become enslaved in the first place. You got here as a result of your actions. You reaped what you sowed, humanity. You got here because you enslaved yourself through this mechanism we call government. Government is known as a monopoly on violence. It cannot be limited because its violence is seen as legitimate. It's evil that everybody sees as moral or allowed because it's authority, it's cops, it's police, it's law. And therefore, somehow it's an exception to morality, and legality becomes morality. The act of slavery condoned by statism leads to the condition of slavery government, which is known as the state. Statism is the belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain human beings, naturally, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This is all man-made, of course. This authority means that certain people, who we call government, have the right to rule over other people. They have this moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws set by their masters. If you're going to say, this is all wrong, Cory, government is not slavery and just depends on what form, you still want your will to be done, I want to know how, without violence. If it's a voluntary system, it's not government. If it's not violence, it's not government. You know, if it's not a man-made system and natural authority is the authority, it's not government. It's simply nature. It's simply living your life. And so when you have government and statism is the belief in the legitimacy of slavery. That's most simply put. You know, past all these other really complex definitions and understanding what it is, at the end of the day, it's believing that slavery is legitimate. And the past abolitionists actually warned us about it. My next slide will show you all the abolitionists who actually knew about this very fact of the matter. And never anywhere in the history of the world has government only protected the rights of individuals. It has always done the opposite. You cannot create rights that don't exist in nature. And again, they make justifications and they have their jurisdiction. What does these words mean? Right? Jurisdictare, right? To say what the law is, to tell people this is what nature is, this is what reality is, and we get to create it for all of you. Regardless if you want it or not, this is what it is, and so you have to follow our orders, right? Justification, just facere, to create a right. Not that it's actually right, but to create it, man-made. Not that it's actually right or moral within nature because of natural morality. No, it's unnatural, it's subjective, whatever we decide it is. It doesn't matter what is truthful. Oh, you own yourself, you can only breathe for you. Too bad. Well, I'm going to claim I can breathe for you. Too bad. I'm going to claim to own what you own. It's not truthful. It's not based in truth. Okay? Historically, people first became slaves as a result of government war or government jailing systems. Democide, the top cause of unnatural death, is known as death by government. And willing slaves are hurting their fellow man. That's essentially what happens, right? With World War II, all these cops carrying out the orders of their group doing their duty, being patriotic, and you see all these crowds of people cheering on their leaders as if there's some sort of messiah or savior of them, as if there's some sort of God, right? This unnatural religion, which is government, because people believe in it and beg toward it and say, I want you to change my life. It is the world's greatest religion for that purpose. And the claims that are made against the abolition of slavery, against abolitionism, can actually be made against the abolition of government. Okay, so if you replace the word slavery with government and slaves with people, we're going to do that here. Here are some of the arguments that people used back then to justify slavery. They said slavery has always existed. Okay, well, government has always existed. Every society has slavery. Every society has government. Slaves are not capable of taking care of themselves. So people are not capable of taking care of themselves. Without slavery, there would be chaos. Without government, there would be chaos. Trying to get rid of slavery is foolishly utopian. Trying to get rid of government is foolishly utopian. Forget abolition. A far better plan is to keep the slaves sufficiently well-fed, clothed, housed, and occasionally entertained, and to take their minds off of their exploitation by encouraging them to focus on the better life that awaits them in the hereafter. Well, you can do the same thing with people. Keep them distracted, unaligned with their purpose, their duty, their nature, and keep them in this system that confines them and restricts their brain and prevents them from doing anything natural or essential or beneficial for humanity. Without slavery, who will pick the cotton or build the roads? Right? It's the same thing with government. So, there will always be slavery anyways. There will always be government anyways. Is this true? Is this so? That we can just put government in for slavery and it works? Well, with all these arguments, it works. Is that just a coincidence? Is that just a coincidence that it works so perfectly? And that if we look at the definitions of slavery, the subjection of, or the control of the will of another by threat of violence, that people are doing that through law, through government to this day. And that has happened for as long as slavery has existed. Indeed, because the first form of systemic slavery was actually the first form of systemic government. The only form of government, the first and oldest government, Sumeria, as we may look up and may find out to be. Sumeria was the first and oldest government and also happened to be this first systemic form of slavery. I wonder why. Maybe it's because you're creating a system, creating a class system where people believe that there's others with divine rights to rule, and people believe these people are naturally inferior and have naturally less rights, and they need to beg for permission to be free and be emancipated by their masters. They called that manumission. They called that enfranchisement. The slaves had to work in order to free themselves, but that still required then permission to be free, and that means they're not free. That means they're still a slave. So government is slavery. Let's look at some quotes. Make no mistake, you are a slave and government is your master. The brilliance of your masters, as opposed to conventional slavery, is that they allow you to believe that you earn what you work for and that you own what you buy. It keeps you complacent and agreeable. You actually believe you're free. And people go in their countries and they create these documents and they make you feel a sense of pride and patriotism. Like, I'm part of my country, I'm fighting for my country, I'm free, I'm in the land of America, for example. But that doesn't mean you're free. It doesn't mean that you're actually free. Look how the world has changed over the last 300 years. Has America always been the same state? What has this document done to prevent violence, prevent morality? See, legality is not morality. They're two separate things. Another quote, if there is a state, there must be domination of one class by another, and as a result, slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are the enemies of the state. That's a quote from Mikhail Bakunin, a philosopher from back then. And here's another quote from Strike the Root, understanding the true relationship between those inside of government and those outside of government, and that is the relationship between slave and master. If someone has the right to initiate the use of force on you, if you disobey them, you are essentially their property. If you don't believe me, go on over to Google and type in slave definition, and the first definition you will find is the following: a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. Now, doesn't that sound a whole lot like the relationship between people inside government and people outside government? If you can force people to do things against their will, then you are treating them as if they were your property. You're saying that their nature is bound to you. They naturally belong to you. That you are their natural authority. But you're not. You're a man-made person. You're a man. You're not nature. You're not God. You're claiming to be that, and therefore you're creating this authority which you pulled out of thin air. And you convince people to believe it doesn't make it true, just because you convince them to believe it is true. Government is slavery. The 19th century abolitionists knew this. Many unknown names are excluded, and late 19th century excluded. Okay, so there were a lot of abolitionists after these individuals, and there were a lot of other abolitionists who were not as influential or may have not been seen in history, but there are a lot of abolitionists, and the more I study this, the more I find even more, right? But you have Stephen Pearl Andrews, Josiah Warren, Aidan Ballou, Lysander Spooner, Henry Clark Wright, Jeremiah Hacker. These people all understood government is slavery. Ezra Haywood, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Batchelder Greene, William Lloyd Garrison, and the New England Non-Resistance Society. These individuals had a great sphere of influence too, a lot of them, on abolitionism at the time and promoting the moral cause. And there's, like I said, even other individuals that are not mentioned here, but these are individuals who have done so much work. I mean, these guys had their own newspapers, they had their own societies and meetings, or they meet up with each other and discuss a lot of this stuff, and they had great emphasis on education, not actually political action. Here I have a video which goes over how slavery still exists. It goes a bit more into the history. You can also see in the thumbnail pictures of police badges from back then versus now. The same, and the reason why is because the police was founded actually from the slave patrol in the 1800s. A lot of people don't know that the slave patrol is essentially what founded this organized police system to watch the streets and make sure the slaves do not escape, to make sure the slaves go back to their master. And so you can see the emblems still used to this day are actually related to the emblems they used for the slave patrol. Nothing has changed. 144 proofs government should not and does not exist is another video I did going deep into all the different methods and strategies government uses. I'm sure there's even more. Here's another video for people who think that limited government is the only solution and thinks that that is the end all. I mean, I will say it's a process to understand this knowledge. I wouldn't expect you to get it all at once. But when you understand slavery and understand morality, you understand, right and wrong, two separate ways. There's no in between. Okay? Limited government is the belief that some limited slavery is okay. But again, if you allow any violence, then you got to be careful with that, because that's what was tried in America. Okay, what happened in America was a limited government set to limit itself with documents, and these pieces of paper did nothing. Okay, because the people became uneducated. As the founding fathers said themselves, you need education to free the species and free all of humankind. And they knew that foreign banks would come into control. They even knew, they had some sense of understanding that things could still go wrong, because it's the nature of government. And I think by now they would probably understand, after the abolition of slavery and now what's happening nowadays, that government itself is just a plague on humanity, and it will never work. And this is what we learn from not just thousands of years of experience, but by looking at the nature of slavery and understanding it in its totality and understanding morality and having this great wealth of knowledge, which they did not have back then. I'm not going to say they were bad. I'm not going to put them down, because a lot of them had great ideas. They were moving in the right direction. They recognized natural rights and natural freedom that led to the abolition of slavery. And then the abolitionists, that also built another bridge, but there's more to be done. And I think they recognized it at the time. They said, yeah, there's more we could have done. We could have freed the slaves. And the abolitionists said, yeah, we could have abolished government, or we could have gotten rid of the other forms of slavery. There is always those thoughts in the back of their minds, because they knew too there's more evolution to be made in humanity. It's not over. There's always more to be done. So limited government never works, and it's impossible, and it's wrong. I have a whole documentary about this. This goes into the whole idea of libertarianism, monarchism, constitutionalism. But what I was going to say before was that a lot of us go through this process, so it's okay. You're not the only one, where you go from left versus right or whatever political position to minarchist, where you believe it should be limited, to anarchist, where you actually understand that you are free and are to have no rulers, because that's what the word literally means. We'll talk about that. And here is actually the thumbnail for a video I did that talks about how slavery still exists and most people don't know. This is another video I did going over nature versus government, because that's essentially what we have. Is the natural versus the unnatural in their aggregate. Again, nature is the nature all, the natural. The natural, the greatest manifestation of the natural, and government is the greatest manifestation actually of the unnatural, because it's all man-made, and they create a whole new world based purely on the whims of man. And if you want to learn a lot more about abolitionism and slavery, I actually have a whole series going over each concept, defining it and breaking it down. With my friend Aaron Butler, we actually go into a deep study of it, which is also read from my first book, Slavery Gone for Good. You can find that at nita.one/series. That's called Abolitionism 101. How to just decide a name for it. But basically it is like a mini course going over these concepts more in detail. Now, what is the art of saying no? We talk about abolitionism. Well, it's just one form of saying no. There's two other types of saying no, and that is abnegation and apophasis. So, let's start on the right-hand side of this diagram, apophasis. It's affirmation through negation. And what that means is knowing no, and get to know to say no, to find yes. Okay, so you basically think of it like a multiple choice question on a test, right? And you understand that this is not the right answer, this is not the right answer, and this is not the right answer. And therefore it must be this answer, right? Because you deduced it and understood that this has to be the answer based on learning from all the other answers. Okay, so you're basically acquiring knowledge to understand what is the answer based on what isn't. Okay, that's apophasis. Okay, now you can embrace that, or you can embrace abnegation. But that embrace of apotheosis sort of leads to abnegation as well. Abnegation is willful denial, so straight up just saying no. Knowing to say no. That is abnegation. See, Tolkien, who did The Lord of the Rings, and again I have my presentation about him, he says that the greatest act of change is through abnegation. And I have to agree with that, because any moment in history where we say no to something does make a pretty powerful impact, especially in the case of ending slavery, right? No, this is immoral, it must not exist. No, master, I will not comply. No, I will not put up with your demands. I'm going to defend my property against the British or whoever seeks to take away my own property from me, right? Abnegation is involved in the process of saying no. So while apotheosis is understanding all the no's, abnegation says, I'm going to say no, right? And so it's interesting, because these are all different forms of arts in relation to the idea of no, of denial. And they all are pretty useful, actually, for creating the positive. Now, what is the result of, knowing no to find yes? It's not just knowing how to say no, but it's also having a known no. And that is through abolitionism. That's the riddance through negation. So not the affirmation through negation, but the riddance through negation. It's the known no for the only yes. Because you're saying this does not belong, this must be abolished, and therefore this is what should be. So you're saying this is unnatural, it does not belong, the natural does belong, and therefore it must, right? It must belong. So you're essentially really deducting here, through the art of no, what it is humanity must do. They must deny evil, right? They must find out what is evil to do what is good, and they must keep up what is good and get rid of what's evil. And so this is a process where we go from embrace to result. Abolitionism is that result of abnegation and apotheosis. Right? So again, another way of saying this, if I am to summarize these concepts, is apotheosis is knowing slavery for freedom, right? Because you're saying slavery is this thing we do not want, so then we can attain freedom, which we do want. That's a mental process. And then we have abnegation, which is ending slavery, right? Because we know about slavery, so we got to act on it. So we're ending it. So then we can end all slavery, which is the condition, the resultant condition of all the actions in manifest, of knowing slavery for freedom and of ending slavery. We can then end all slavery. That's abolitionism, right? So getting to the root cause and looking at the whole. So what is the art against violence? This is another very important point, right? Because we talk about violence and how it's connected to law and how it's connected to slavery and connected to violating nature. Because again, the word violence is like violation, right? And we don't want to violate nature, because that is what it means to do wrong. Well, let's start from the left-hand side this time. We have non-violence, which is the idea that you should not do harm, right? It's the peaceful cause. You don't want to do harm, that's it. That's it. You want to live your life, and you want other people to live their life, right? But with that comes also self-defense, which the abolitionists also had to learn over time, because a lot of them were on the non-resistance side, as you'll find out. Self-defense is the idea that you should take no harm. So if somebody does do harm to you, well, you should not take that harm. You need to be aggressive. It's an aggressive response, okay? It's not an aggressive initiation, it's an aggressive response. Because you're not the one causing the violence, you're the one putting the violence to rest, saying this should not exist, abolish the violence, right? And therefore, you bring things back to peace. You bring things back to the way things are supposed to be, where people should not do harm, right? They should learn from that. And therefore, the result condition should be non-resistance, which is to never do harm, right? That is the goal of humanity. And what we want to do is at least to violate nature as much as possible. So if we never do harm and we never violate nature, that is non-resistance, right? That's the peaceful response. So we have a peaceful cause, which is to do no harm, and then we have a peaceful response, which is to never do harm. But that might mean, well, are you going to self-defend against yourself? You may not. You may actually choose not. So that's why your response might either be self-defense or non-resistance, because in the case of Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., right, civil disobedience and the idea that you don't have to respond with violence might be more powerful than responding with violence. Again, this is the importance of time and place, what we talked about before, a really crucial concept that a lot of people forget. And so, never do harm. But also, you probably shouldn't take harm either. Any animal in nature is going to probably defend itself if it gets attacked. And so you should too, because otherwise you can't express your natural nature. Your nature will no longer persist. So if this is the art against violence, what is the art for violence? And this is where things get pretty interesting. So instead of, non-violence, self-defense, and non-resistance, we have violence, defense, and resistance itself. Well, violence says to do or justify harm. That's the cause. It's an aggressive cause. It's not a peaceful cause anymore. It's an aggressive cause. It's to justify harm, right? I can do harm. I can do this, right? I'm going to hurt this person. It's violence, right? I want to violate somebody's rights. I want to violate their nature. That is what violence is. Now, what is the response for that? But again, this is the art for violence. So that would mean these responses would have to enable or continue the first cause, okay? Violence. It would have to continue violence or allow it to manifest more. So, if we look at defense, we see quote-unquote enforcement, where people claim others harm. They say, well, I don't need to actually self-defend myself. I'll have other people do it. Now, in a private sense, that's okay. People can defend others, right? And defend others' rights. But it's a cop-out response. It leads to the lack of self-responsibility. It leads to the Hegelian dialectic. Meaning, somebody might do harm to you purposefully so they can keep their services intact so that you can still depend on them for their defense contracts, for their defense promises to you. They will purposefully do harm so you can see how important they are in your life. Problem, react, solution. That's what the government does. They'll cause problems or false flag events, as they do throughout history, to justify the need for defense. And people will see that as useful because, well, it's defending themselves. It's defending their rights and defending their assets, as people say government is so necessary to do. But that's because they want people in that belief system so they can continue their slavery, continue their existence. So defense is necessary for violence. Isn't that interesting? It's necessary for violence if that violence wants to be continued, because that enforcement is the one doing both. Think about that. What if the enforcement is actually doing both violence and defense, and therefore a lot of people can't detect it as violence? That is what we have with the police system to this day, and I would want you to reflect on what I just said, because of course this one takes a little bit more of a mind wrap to understand. But let's look at resistance, because maybe that'll help a little bit more. It's the idea that you should never allow dissent. Okay, it's an authoritative response. The fact that, hey, I'm an authority, you should not disobey me ever. Okay, so if you disobey me, I am going to use violence against you. And I'm going to also probably say that I'm defending everybody else against your, non-compliance, which is dangerous to society, because that makes you a criminal. That makes you a person who's dangerous because you're not complying like everyone else is doing. So I'm going to apply resistance. And I'm going to say that that is defense, so I can legitimize my act of violence. That is what government does, and that is an art that they utilize. An art that a lot of people do not understand, like martial arts, all this really crazy martial arts that people do. No one's going to understand what to do in a fight if somebody uses martial arts against them, and they don't know what those martial arts are, right? Or how to defend from them. So knowledge is power in this sense, and knowledge is power for understanding violence itself, or knowledge itself. These crucial concepts to what we're talking about. And so if you ask yourself, well, how did we get here, right? How did the government manage to grow thousands of years in time? How did slavery continue to grow thousands of years in time? Well, let's look at how government works, using the simple example of a wheelchair. It breaks your legs, and then it sells you a wheelchair at 10 times actual cost. Then it taxes that wheelchair. Then it regulates your use of that wheelchair. Then it assures you that without government, you wouldn't be getting around so well. So notice they break your legs first, and then they say, well, we have a solution for that. So problem, react, solution. This is the Hegelian dialectic, right? And since you depend on them, you're not self-responsible. And if you give way to that lack of self-responsibility, you're not so free because you're dependent, right? You're giving way to your own slavery. And so how does someone become a slave? If we look at this in a historical sense, and this is an excerpt from my book. Mentally or physically, for servitude. That's how someone becomes a slave, right? Again, mentally, where you think you're supposed to be a slave, or physically, where you're forced to be a slave. Either they are convinced to be a slave mentally for themselves or for others, or they are violently complied into being a slave physically. People have historically become physical slaves as a result of government war or government jailing systems. Children of slaves become automatic slaves. Okay, so that is how government got here. It started with a monopoly on violence, people coming together and forcing their will against people who cannot defend themselves, people who have no choice but to subject themselves to that system, and people order following, saying, you know what, yeah, I'm going to fight for this ideology and this belief system, and I think it should be imposed upon everyone. I'm going to commit violence on the world to make sure it's done. So I want to be God, I want to be the authority, I want to denature reality. That's essentially how it begins and how it continues, both. That's why statism hits at the root to not just limiting government, but getting rid of it. Because it's either you go more toward tyranny and chaos and slavery, or more toward freedom and order and prosperity, because that's what freedom provides. If you want a lot more information about why government is slavery, I would recommend reading my book Slavery Gone for Good, nita.one/truth. Again, that's optional. Or you can look up The End of All Evil. There's a lot of people who've done readings of it. You can find it for free on different places. That's a book by Jeremy Locke. Puts it very simply. Just like mine, mine is also in question-answer format. Really easy. Good for teachers and students alike. One that goes really deep into the belief system of statism that a lot of people also recommend, and I highly recommend, is The Most Dangerous Superstition, which you will find out by reading my book is one of the recommended resources as well. A book that I highly recommend. Great, and it's going to live forever in time because it's dealing with understanding the unnatural manifestation known as government. Government is slavery because it's the epiphany of man-made authority. It is the unnatural or immoral condition. It is the manifest unnatural. That's essentially what it is. Okay? Because if we look at government, and we relate this to a lot of the terms we talked about before, and a lot of the concepts we talked about before. Is there natural law? Is there natural learning? How about growth, freedom, problems, effects, currency, medicine, attraction, powers, experimentation, facts, professions, religion, diet, environments, health, intelligence, change, leadership, simplicity? I mean, I told you that the powers that be will want artificial intelligence to their benefit to control the population. They don't want people healthy because they can't think for themselves. They want to control the environment so they can continue their control over the people. They can control the diet to control the health. They can create unnatural professions with all the titles and the business suits. They can create unnatural facts by keeping people focused on the mainstream media and the events and the news happening every single day. They can conduct experiments against their own population because they see them as chattel and cattle, literally, because they can do whatever they want and people will obey or follow their orders. They have unnatural powers because people are suppressing their conscience, the cops and the politicians, and saying, I have to do this, I have a duty, and I'm in this position, and this gives me more rights than other human beings. They create unnatural attractions into creating worlds and some sort of utopian ideal of, well, if we use this system, it'll work. If we use this system, it'll work. Of people imposing their will on others, right? They suppress natural medicine, and they say, well, here, use the pharmaceutical medicine, because again, it contributes to the unnatural health. They use unnatural currency and start printing paper material and different forms of currency that is used everywhere, and says this is the centralized currency and we have a monopoly on violence, and we also have control through international banks that allows us to control people and what they do because they're limited by their resources and effects. Everything that they do is an unnatural effect. Unnatural problems. They create problems no one knows how to control, not even themselves. It grows out of control because so many people are order following and going against their own nature. And you have unnatural freedom because people believe they're free, but they're not actually free. They're not free at all. Unnatural growth. That's what happens. We de-evolve as a human species. But then we would evolve if we realize it's a plague to humanity and realize it must end. Right? So we learn from that. But that's only from using natural learning, which government definitely doesn't want, and that's why they also control our school systems and make sure that our school systems are government ran and teaching propaganda and what they want being taught to our kids for their own compliance into their own system of unnatural law, which has no regard for natural law because it has nothing to do with morality and nothing to do at all with understanding nature or nature as authority. It's all about man-made authority. So what is the opposite of government? It's anarchy, right? And people are all afraid of anarchy. Well, perfect for their agenda, because you can say freedom is chaos. And therefore, what is the opposite? Order is slavery? That doesn't sound so well to me, because it isn't. It doesn't make any sense. Freedom is actually chaos. Freedom is actually order, because it actually brings people together, obligates them to do so, and people are self-organizing. People are not dumb when they're given the opportunity to organize together and work together to make things happen. You see it all the time with communities, and you see it in farmers markets where people are trading with each other voluntarily in different networks. All voluntary hierarchies that don't require any violence at all to create. It's beautiful to see, right? But yet in politics we provide an exception and say, well, it's okay to use violence here and there and there. When is it ever okay to use violence? Violence is violence. It's never okay. See? Anarchy, from the word anarchon, means no rulers, not no rules. And so who rules you naturally? Okay? If I am to say, well, I want anarchy, okay, because I don't want anybody ruling over me, I'm saying I want no masters, no slaves. But is there a ruler over me? Well, if there is, it would be nature, right? It would be myself or nature. It would be God. It would be this greater power that is not man. And so anarchy is freedom because I'm able to do as much as nature limits me, not man. Freedom is provided by nature. We talked about natural freedom before and what makes it different from unnatural freedom. Freedom is your given condition of possibility. It's the epiphany of natural authority to have nature as your authority, which is anarchy because there is no one ruler. If you look out in nature, you see that everything is sort of chaotic, but in an order of its own. And things, families stay together, tribes stay together, the bugs and the animals, they work together too. But we have conscience, we have reason, we have higher abilities, so we can change a lot of things in our environment. That's what makes us dangerous, but also really powerful and able to do great wonders to the world and helping species and animals and plants and things live together, like I talked about before with regenerative agriculture, right? So the idea is not to be God or be nature, but to work with it, and therefore we're recognizing a natural authority. We're not having any rulers other than ourselves or our family, which is, they're still not rulers over us. They're guides. We're all helping each other. We're all influencing each other. That doesn't make any of us rulers. Doesn't make any of us masters. It doesn't give us any special rights over each other. It makes us all equal and the same on the same level playing field, so we can create the world we want to create together. Right? And so anarchy, otherwise known as freedom or nature, is the natural moral condition because nature is the natural. It is the natural. Right? The most natural. It is the moral condition because it is the natural condition. And here are some really helpful images that really sum up what I'm saying. Anarchism is not a romantic fable, but the hard-headed realization based on 5,000 years of experience, more than that we cannot entrust the management of our lives to kings, priests, politicians, generals, and county commissioners. Plato also said, good people don't need laws to tell them to act responsibly. and bad people will find a way around the laws. Okay, well then what use is the law then, right? And it's funny, by the way, to note 5,000 years of experience around there is when Samaria was created. And if you look at human history, apparently we've been on Earth for over 300,000 years. So yeah, government is not something that is natural or that has always existed, by the way. Larkin Rose also said here, what in the history of the world, anywhere on the planet, has working within the system achieved freedom? For all these people out there who are like, we need political action. Like that's going to give us our freedom. To put it another way, when has a slave ever achieved freedom by whining to his master or by getting a new master? Exactly. Because it's still slavery, right? Now here's another quote from Jeffrey Tucker, anarchy is all around us. Without it, our world would fall apart. All progress is due to it. All order extends from it. All blessed things that rise above the state of nature are owned to it. The human race thrives only because of the lack of control, not because of it. I'm saying that we need ever more absence of control to make the world a more beautiful place. It is a paradox that we must forever explain. See, I really like that one, because for him saying anarchy is all around us, nature is all around us. This is just another word for nature, believe it or not, when we're referring to the condition of nature and the macro, right? Because, of course, if we apply anarchy to the sense of the individual, I am the ruler of myself. I'm a monarch. One ruler, right? Mono-archon. I'm an internal monarch. And whereas if I wanted freedom for everybody and I'm not in control of them, that would be external anarchy. So you can get a little bit more specific about it and say we need internal monarchy for external anarchy, because let's face it, in order to create freedom, in order to be free, if a slave is on a plantation enslaved by their master, the first step is realizing that they're free. Again, Harriet Tubman said, I could have freed more slaves if I could have convinced them that they were slaves. You have to be able to break the mental slavery barrier to recognize you're free and practice freedom in order to be free in the very first place. So you can't just create anarchy out of nowhere. You have to create anarchy over time in practice of knowledge, of sovereignty that you acquire through the knowledge that you are to be sovereign, because you are naturally sovereign. By nature, you own yourself. And here I have a video that talks about how you are already a real anarchist and you don't even know it, right? And so that's a video I would recommend for anybody new to this concept and to the idea that nature is anarchy. And so when it comes to solving problems, because everybody wants to ask all day, well, what about this, what about that? Well, really, things happen naturally on its own, as it is intended by nature. People come together and make things happen, and like I said, they're obligated to do so. So you have free markets, people working together and setting up farmers markets like I mentioned before. You actually have small businesses now. Wow, happy, amazing. I mean, because now you have people who aren't being taxed half or more of their income in certain places. You know, people can actually live their lives and produce what they want to produce. If they have a really good product and it's really going to sell, and it's going to be a competition that makes people want to create better products. And it's a beautiful world to see. I wouldn't say it's all that beautiful and that, you know, there's going to be sunshines and unicorns and, you know, utopia. No, definitely not. There's still going to be problems, but again, is it going to be an unnatural problem? Is it going to aggregate and turn into worse problems? Is it going to turn into overt slavery? Is it going to be covert slavery? No, it's not even going to manifest if everybody realizes what slavery is and sees it as wrong and is looking out to see if it's going to happen. But we live in a world where people have given away their responsibility and their ownership. So that's why reminding people of their nature and instilling in principles through the generations, through our children, the idea of self-ownership, of sovereignty, of natural law, and a lot of things we talked about will do a great service to humanity in making sure that this destiny is fulfilled, that we do progress and evolve as humanity rather than regress and devolve into a dystopia, rather than the closest thing as to a utopia, which would be nature itself. Right? I mean, you can see all sorts of new structures being built. I have a picture there of some people building, you know, within nature, sort of integrating with the system. I mean, there's so many people with great ideas of how things would work, but they're not allowed to because the government is limiting them. And there's a lot of, you know, doctors out there who, you know there's certain cures that are really helpful for people, and they're not allowed to give away that medicine because the government says you're not allowed to. You know, it's just as simple as having this law, this piece of paper, and this person saying, I have the authority to shut down your entire business and basically do whatever they want to you, and that makes you a slave. You're not supposed to be a slave. So recognizing, again, your freedom is what makes you free and what will naturally create this world that we want to live in. I mean, you see a variety of food and potlucks and people coming together. This is what I want to see. I want to see community again. I want to see people having fun. And instead of playing the political games all day, which exhaust our energy, and people put so much money into it as well, people can actually put their time and energy into things that matter, like their own life, living, having fun. And actually, you know, by doing these things right now, we can actually attain a free world. Yes, this is part of the process. And now it's not the only part of the process, we'll talk about that, but it's part of the process. You know, this is not just the world that we can create, it's also the world that we can create now. We can start having potlucks and getting together and trying to create a free market where we can, you know, trying to get people doing freedom-based interactions, voluntary interactions. A lot of people might call this voluntarism, for example. So I have a video talking about this. Society without government works best. It's a whole documentary. A lot of people enjoy going over a lot of these issues and a lot of the complaints people have. And you'll find out that you can complain all day. The point is that's not what we're here to do. The abolitionists could have said all day, like, who will do this without the slaves, but actually production got even better after slavery was abolished. And it's good that people ask those questions, though, because that means that they're curious, but they have to be responsible. The question I would ask you is, what would you do about it? Right? What would you do about it? Would you just sit by and let somebody else be aggressed upon? No, you would step in, you would help them, you would try to defend that person. You wouldn't call the cops or wait on anyone else to do it. You would take charge and actually learn to be responsible. And that's what nature lets you do, you know? You go in nature, you have to learn how to survive. You have to learn how to do things. And so the same thing with our world in reality, without authority figures always holding your hand all the time saying, you know, well, you can do this or you can do this if, you know, you give me some of your cut, and I'll help you do this, and, you know, it's the best way to do it and it's for the common good, and all these justifications so you can lose your responsibility. No. Anarchy, which is, again, no rulers, and nature, which is one and the same, because nobody is in control of anybody else. Naturally, we all have the same rights by nature. That's why we say we're created with the same rights, not that we necessarily exercise them as such. But when we recognize that, when we recognize nature itself and what is natural, we attain knowledge, right? That is how we know what is natural, and that allows us to be responsible. That allows us to have ownership, which is the internal one ruler, which allows us to be sovereign, which then is nature embraced, because externally there's no rulers, but internally there's one ruler. Okay, so this is the diagram that shows you how we go from nature recognized to nature embraced. And so a world technically harmonized with nature is a world without government, a world where people are responsible for themselves. This is the big elephant in the room, because government is plaguing our nature the most and affecting it the most. You have to wonder why I went from talking about nature and what is natural to government, because it's affecting everybody in every field and claims over all the land and all the people and all the businesses. It's literally claiming to be nature itself. So if anybody claims to care about nature, well, I want to see you start talking about the government. I want you to start tackling the belief system that creates it. Stop saying they, and start blaming ourselves and encouraging the public to get involved and educate the public. Right? That is what I want to see, and so that's why I create shirts to go along with this message. You can find these at nita.one/slavery. If you're interested, it can help with sharing the message and recognizing our nature. But here's a diagram that compares abolitionism with anarchism. You'll see abolitionism is action-based, because we're focusing on the action of abolishing, whereas anarchism is ideological. It can be political or economic. Right? People have anarcho this and narco that. I mean, look at all these different types of anarchism, and a lot of these guys, they'll debate all day. I mean, they'll literally talk to each other all day about, oh, well, how will this work and how will that work, and oh, your idea is bad, your idea is bad. The whole idea is that no one idea gets to dominate over any other person's idea. That's the whole idea of anarchism to begin with. So a lot of these factions will lose touch with the root. And that's why abolitionism, in my view, hits more at the root. Now, I'm okay with either term if you understand what they actually mean, right? But anarchism is also has a stigma, right? People hear the word anarchism, they think chaos. They think it means that you are a disorderly individual who doesn't believe in, free natural rights and, people coming together, and when it could be totally the opposite, because you understand it just means anarchon, which means no rulers, right? That's all it means, no rulers. But a lot of people tend to make it political, and a lot of people tend to add ideologies to it, and that's where it just loses touch with what it actually is supposed to be. So if we look at abolitionism, which was used in the past to abolish slavery, it means an action, right? And it's history reputable. It was used in history, and it worked before. And it has a moral focus. It says, we're doing this because we're moral, right? So when I call myself an abolitionist instead of an anarchist, it causes a surprise. It gets people questioning, like, why are you an abolitionist? Does slavery still exist? They know exactly what I'm talking about. And if they don't know what it is, well, then they can talk about it, but at least it creates a conversation, and they don't have any stigmas or preconceived notions of who I am. Okay, so it allows people to question the morality of the situation, since slavery is a moral issue. And when you mention slavery, the first thing that's going to come to most people's minds today is how immoral it is and how, it was upheld and it was ended. Right? But what people need to understand is that slavery still does exist, and the abolitionists did tell us themselves. And so abolitionism says no slavery, whereas anarchism says no rulers. They're essentially one and the same, but which one, in your view, is more direct? I'll have you decide for yourself on that, right? But for the images that I provide on the abolitionism side, you'll see there's newspapers, right? Which show, hey, am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister, right? The Pleasure Boat, which was a magazine that was created, a newspaper, at the time to help abolish slavery, right? And that was there to educate people. And the Liberator, the same thing. Our country is the world. Our countrymen are all mankind. Can we not apply that to government and people with their special titles and badges? I mean, again, the coincidences are everywhere. And you have this almanac where this black man is being tied up by the slave patrol saying, you need to come with us back to the plantation. I mean, it's a moral focus. They have artwork, they have poetry, they have all these texts and writings. They focused on the education. Well, what is anarchism doing? Are they focusing on the education about their ideologies? Or are they so focused on debating people to prove that their ideology is the best? Are they so focused on the identity and the colors and, oh, this is so cool, it's black and yellow, man, oh, it's red and black, and oh, this guy and his philosophy was so cool, man, I don't care about any of that. It doesn't matter to me. I care about ending slavery. I care about the moral focus, and that's an action. I don't identify as anything, I'm a human being. I'm simply myself, right? And when I start identifying with all this other stuff, I start to alienate myself. So I'm committing an action. I'm an abolitionist. I'm here to abolish slavery. That's it. That's all I'm doing. You can decide for yourself, but this is really the only real divide. Okay, this is the real divide, the only real divide, because you can use the word anarchist or abolitionist or voluntarist or sovereign, and they all mean the same thing in the real sense of understanding that you want natural authority. This is the non-statist. It's to live in reality. It is to understand that you want to naturally naturalize, right? You want to live in reality, naturalizing. You want to embrace your life in nature. And whereas a statist is the slave master, the slave or the subject, the rulers or the royalty, right? And it's those who want man-made authority, to live in illusion, to denature all of humankind, to fit people's wills and people's whims, and I'm not here to do that. I'm here to recognize there's a natural authority that is ourselves in the natural world, as evident by looking literally nearly anywhere. When we're trying to find the truth, it's not something that man created. When we're trying to find reality, it's not something that man created. So if the truth is found in nature, as because the truth is ever present and it's always been here, then that is our authority. That's what we must seek. That's what we must understand. And therefore, we're not statist. We're simply human beings living our lives. Whereas the people who don't want other people to live their own lives, wants to meddle in everybody's business and tell them what to do and tell them how to live their own lives, those are the statists. They can't dwell with responsibility of themselves. They need somebody, a caretaker, to always be over them. And that's okay if they don't drag everybody into the net with them, saying, oh, you need to comply and you need to comply, and if you don't comply, you're going to be violently complied. Big difference. Big difference. So we want people who are peaceful, right? Who are just living their lives and not enslaving their fellow man, or not, violently imposing their will on their fellow man. Is this really hard to ask? Again, the only real divide now is those who want natural authority and those who want man-made authority, where nature is the answer versus man is the answer. What is your answer? Is it the natural or is it the unnatural? So let me ask you again, what happens when nature is confused or unknown? Well, slavery was seen as natural. That's what happens when nature is confused or unknown. And it hurts humanity badly. Here is a huge diagram that goes into everything we need to know about nature and denaturing. I made this several years ago, comparing nature is the answer versus man is the answer, or government, statism, right? All one the same. And of course, we want to integrate and promote, learn, educate, and attract nature. And we want to disintegrate and demote, red pill, or detract from denature, statism, government, man-made authority, right? And so if we understand positive and negative expressions, positive are those expressions that contribute to good in society, right? Manifested natural. Whereas the negative is evil, manifested bad, right? Manifested unnatural. What is multiplicative and divisive? Well, multiplicative would help contribute to the positive, and divisive would contribute to the negative. So in divisive, we see imbalance, suppression, illusion, oppression, and negative expression. Okay? Now, since this was covered in a previous presentation of mine that was rather detailed, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I want it to be more self-explanatory. I actually have easier ways of interpreting this in just a second, but multiplicative is courage, conversation, responsibility, guidance, and positive expression, ultimately, right? Because that's what it's leading to. Positive expression, manifested positive, is manifested order. Manifested negative is manifested chaos. So, do you want to multiplicate the positive? Because if you do that, then you create more positive, right? What this really is naturalizing for the natural and denaturing for the unnatural, right? That is essentially what multiplicative for positive is and divisive for negative is, okay? So, it takes courage to love, it takes conversation for knowledge, responsibility for sovereignty, guidance for freedom, imbalance for fear, suppression for ignorance, illusion for confusion, and oppression for control. You're denaturing to make unnatural, and you're naturalizing to make natural. That is the main difference in this chart, okay? And it's evident, because what already is natural is what already existed. And if you want to make unnatural, well, you have to start denaturing the natural. You don't create anything new. You twist what already exists into what you want to exist. And that's why you want certain things to be true, but it's not actually true. If we are to relate these positive and negative expressions to the natural and unnatural chart we talked about in the very beginning, this is where we can make a lot of connections as well, right? If you love someone, are you going to be honest with them? If you love someone, would you want them to be healthy? Would you be right, to them? Would you lie to them, Would you be truthful to them? Would you be real to them? These all correlate because, again, the natural is the wrong and the natural is the right and the unnatural is the wrong. So, negative, fear. Well, if you want someone to be unhealthy, well, you fear them being healthy, right? If you want someone to be wrongful, you fear that they're right. And this is why governments want people to be wrong. And they fear people being right, but we fear being right as well, because they got us in fear as well. They have us in an unnatural system to legitimize their own unnatural system. Again, regression. So realize that these expressions go hand in hand. And again, try telling me that all this means nothing, and try living your life without these words, because I guarantee you, you can't do it. That's how important it is in this life. If you're healthy, are you sovereign? Well, you have your own body, you can breathe for yourself, you can do all these things that you don't really need much help for, because you can walk for yourself. If you're unhealthy, it's going to be harder for you to walk for yourself. You're going to need help to move, right? To do anything. So it's just funny how it works, but all this is just so perfectly connected. Again, you need knowledge to have the natural, to be honest, to have health, to be right, to be truthful. You need freedom to do any one of these things. I mean, it's no coincidence, and that's why order is in nature. And disorder and chaos is just out of nature, because nature itself operates by an order. Again, my digestive system operates by an order. Everything works together. The ecosystem corresponds to what goes on and accounts for reactions. And you have this ebb and flow that's constantly at work. That is an order that's trying to be achieved by nature. And it's up to us if we want to align to that. So it's important to understand that nature does not fit into any one ideology or philosophy or religion or science. All those things anyways are to study nature. And that's why I created Naturosophy, right? Which is saying this is the importance of nature. But it is just one way of looking at things, in particular the methods that I use and the terms that I use and the term label that I use. All that doesn't matter. What really matters is the context of knowledge and what we do with that knowledge, which is why we're going to delve into action. But let's look at it. We have Stoicism, Transcendentalism, Naturalism, Naturism. All these may have their time and place, may have great value in them, and people quote these guys all the time. They have a lot of information and a lot of writings. I'm not going to discount them, but nor am I going to uphold them and say these are the best and let's put them on a pedestal and let's rule the whole world with it. See, again, and when we talk about slavery like we did before, the whole idea of understanding our nature is that in a world of freedom, in a world of nature, you have uniqueness. You have tons of different solutions and tons of different types of ideologies, but nobody's forcing their will on another, because that would be slavery. Nobody's telling others how to live their life, because that would be slavery. People are educators instead. They use moral persuasion, just like the abolitionists would in the 1800s, because now everybody sees it as immoral. Not that it's illegal, but because it's immoral. So that is not the role of an ideology. It's the role of human beings understanding who they are as human beings. Nothing more, nothing less. It's understanding their nature. And so there's other terms that you can use as well, for nature, right? There's signature, natured, connatural, naturopath, right? Which they also say is naturopath, two separate ways, just like Naturosophy and Naturosophy. Naturalist or naturalistic, semi-natural, naturism, supernatural, right? These are all terms that use the word nature in them, and these are sort of my definitions of these terms, right? The signature is you, sign of you, your nature. I'm signing my nature here. So it's interesting, when you put your name on something, you sign something, it's a contract, you're saying my nature belongs here. This paper signs my nature. Okay, so it's important where you perhaps put your name. It's a proof of authenticity. That's why people use a signature, because it's meant to be you. And people have other terms of saying it's autograph or signature or whatever. You get the point. It's supposed to represent you. Natured, a description of a nature. So if I say this person is good-natured or bad-natured, like we talked about before, or it's in the nature of this thing to do that, or I say it's second nature to do this or that, right? We talked about before how there's base nature, core nature, simple nature, true nature, original nature. I mean, as long as you understand the context that's being used, these are just terms to represent something more about the nature of something, right? So connatural would actually mean similar nature. So take, for example, conscience, right? The word conscience science, to know together. Well, con-natural is natures together, similar natures. The fact that we all have conscience, for example. Nature path is allowing or toward nature, a path toward nature. But usually when people use the word nature path, they refer to the field of naturopathic medicine and health, which has principles that we talked about before, and also integrative nutrition is another field, right? Has principles that apply to health and apply to the nature of human beings. If they're looking at health, they're looking at nature. Again, we equate these terms one and the same because health means whole. And what is more whole or holistic than the world of nature itself? That's as whole as you can get. Naturalist, right? Well, if I say this is the naturalist thing to occur, like EST at the end, instead IST at the end, usually it refers to a type of identity, but then if you say ISTIC, naturalistic, then it still goes back to the idea of effect, right? So saying naturalist, like LEST, which nobody would say, kind of sounds like naturalist to me. So I would say to natural effect or effector, in case if we are using the identity of it's a person rather than an effect. So these are just, again, semantics, but this is the way I look at these terms. Semi-natural means that there is need of knowledge because it's not so natural, or at least we don't know where it is natural and where it isn't, right? Because again, where are you looking? If I look at glasses and say, well, that's unnatural, it's a very blanket statement. What do you mean it's unnatural? It's natural to help the eyes if it assists the natural natures, but it's unnatural perhaps to exist in the fact that we are supposed to have eyes that are natural to do these certain functions. You have to look at the individual natures, which requires knowledge, and if you disregard that, then you're sort of disregarding knowledge itself. Naturism is actually somewhat of a philosophy of people who think that we shouldn't really wear clothes, right? And that's natural bodily expression, okay? Great, naturism. I could call this whole thing naturism. But I think that stands for proof that society is sort of detached from their natural roots to not see, that sort of outward expression in today's world. And, if somebody can eat some raw carcass in front of them or, drink some blood or, wear no clothes. I mean, these things would be surprising to a lot of people nowadays because they're so conditioned to the man-made world. And I'm not saying that's what people should do to the man-made world, but it comes as a shock because of their detachment. Okay, so it's not to say, again, that you should do those things, but you should build a tolerance and understand those things and why it's done. And don't be like, oh my gosh, wow, they're eating, raw meat, or oh my gosh, they're expressing their natural born self. Because these are things that our ancestors did all the time, right? And when we get a stigma around clothes or no clothes, and the idea of like, wow, we need to always wear clothes, or we always need to have glasses, or we always need cars, what are we building for ourselves, right? And what expectations then come of that? What price does it have, right? Because on the environment and of production needs, of attachment can be a big problem, and the need of more responsibilities then. Because if you have so many material things, that's more things you have to be responsible for if you say it's your property, and then are you really responsible for yourself because you're responsible for all these other things? Are you going to be responsible for all those things? Can you? It becomes overwhelming, and we see this is why a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of power are not actually so happy despite having that. More money, more problems, more laws, more problems, right? More of these man-made things are actually causing more problems, which is the opposite of what people think, which is why they invite these man-made things into their life. Supernatural, right, would be too natural to often comprehend. So I say, angels and miracles and these things happening in nature, sort of going beyond the laws of nature, we might call those supernatural. So if it's so natural, how am I supposed to really know as a natural human being, especially detached from the natural world in today's world? If we are detached from who we are, then we have a farther chance from actually understanding the supernatural. May you see it. Because it's so natural, we can't see it. We're so far down the road that at least if we were more natural or more in tune with our lives and nature, maybe it would be easier to comprehend or understand the supernatural. And perhaps there's a connection there between, the natural and the supernatural when it comes to taking medicinals like mushrooms or psychedelics, which cause people to see a whole new reality that is so too much to comprehend. They can't even describe it with words. The man-made can't supplement for what that natural medicinal does. And man can try to modify it, but it often turns dangerous, right? Or it turns addictive, and it turns into something totally different. And so when you look at these medicinals in nature, you realize, wait, these can actually help people to some extent or wake them up. There's a lot of people I know that have had experiences with it. I haven't myself, but it is something worth mentioning that nature does provide those tools, perhaps as a tool to be used. I don't think our dependence on those tools would necessarily be a great idea, since we are supposed to be wise and of knowledge. We could intake that knowledge past our ignorance. But if we're so delved deep into our ignorance, maybe some sort of assistance from nature itself could help. Absolutely. I mean, what happens is we get chaos, we get negative effects, and then we learn our lesson anyways. So having these wake-up calls can save people a lot of time, potentially, a lot of stress, a lot of energy, but it could also, again, that dependence and the saying, well, we need this, we need that, I think we have to be very careful with that. We have to be conscious. So we may know about the problems, but what about the solutions, right? And again, what I talked about before was the idea of embrace. To face the problem is to embrace the solutions. So you sort of already know the solutions based on what I said, if you were paying attention, if you understand it. You see, if you understand everything I've said so far, you basically already know the solutions. I shouldn't have to really tell you, and you need to be able to configure it within your own life. But if you want some solutions, I'll be able to hand it to you and tell you what is needed on the micro and macro scale from a generalized point of view. So when we look at nature, or Naturosophy, we actually learn of both the problem and the solution, as I just mentioned. And I'm going to actually say this is moral and morale. Alright? Now, first of all, before we get into this, I just want to say we are social animals. We're thinking animals. And therefore, we're supposed to be social, we're supposed to be thinking, and we want to nurture that aspect of our nature. We want to allow ourselves to think, allow ourselves to reflect, and allow ourselves to socialize, because we are to. And without that fabric that makes us humankind, since it's part of our nature, we may lose a sense of our nature, right? So again, use your nature for nature. And so individual action and collective action are together, and they're both correlated here, moral and morale, because again, the principle of correspondence, as above so below, there is a connection between yourself and the world around you. You help contribute to the manifest. And so what is moral is the individual action. It's what keeps you, okay? Whereas what is morale is collective action. It's what keeps you going, okay? So there's a big difference here. Moral is individual, morale is collective. This is how I'm going to interpret both of these words for the purpose of more wisdom. For the purpose of understanding, well, these words are very related, perhaps because they are. Moral is doing the natural, and morale is sharing the natural, which you automatically would do by sharing your presence, by saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and look how everybody else is having all these problems, but I'm not. Or is it preferable to live in this environment versus that environment? You can see it for your own eyes so long as you are opening your eyes, right? And this is what we ask of the world, is for people to simply be present and learn from this knowledge and hear it out, to say the least. Get involved and don't just shut it off and say, well, it's all unimportant, or oh, it's idolizing nature, or it's this philosophy or ideology. No. You need to understand what it is. You can't just say it's this or that. Where's the encouragement of knowledge on that? Where's the wisdom on that? Right? So the moral part, the individual action, is the internal action. Because morality and conscience is something that you have individually, right? And you have a natural authority that you personally have a connection to. Everybody does. Okay, now again, you can call that God or whatever, but you can call it even natural moral law itself. But regardless, you have a conscience. It's within your nature. You have empathy. You have the power, the capacity to reason, to share an order with the rest of other human beings, to create an order, right? And when somebody does something wrong, we feel a disturbance in the force. We feel chaos at work, and we realize that there needs to be something that's changed to create that order again. And so we have it in ourselves to fix our problems, but if we push it down and say, well, I want to create order, but I can't, and I depend on this authority or that authority, or it has to go through legislation or what have you, then we're suppressing our nature and not doing things as we shall. Because if, let's say, we were to free the prisoners and they came back to their hometowns, right, it would be the community's obligation, moral responsibility, to teach them morality and teach their neighbors morality and be responsible, defend their property and their neighbors and their friends, and allow these prisoners to repent now, right? Allow them to say sorry and make up for their actions now, or, you know, suffer the consequences directly, deal with the problem that needs to be dealt with. If these people are not willing to fix their problems, well, then you fix the problem. You're not going to wait on somebody else to do it for you, because that would be a lack of responsibility. And if need be, you get together with the community and decide what needs to be done. But, you know, it isn't where we have this one authority and it decides how everything should be done. No, this is the beauty of freedom, where again you have so many different philosophies and so many different people, and that you have so many then different solutions, but nobody is seen as one person has all the solutions. One person is the authority. Now, of course, some people are going to be really good at what they do. There's a lot of things that I'm not good at that a lot of other people are good at. Tons of people, right? But not one of us is adept to do everything or be in charge of everything. And so we always have to work together. That's how we have real self-governance, which is not slavery, because, again, try to think about this. Self-slavery negates the whole notion of slavery. It's like saying slavery to nature. Again, you can't do that because you, by nature, already are bound to yourself. So you can't undo that. That's something that is already there. Slavery implies an imposed man-made condition. Okay? So we need to look at it like such and understand our role within our communities. We do have the need to be responsible, the need to take charge of what's going on in the world and not just sit back. And you know what? We'll be happier, we'll have destiny, we'll find our purpose, we'll find more answers, we'll have more answers because we're more involved, we'll have more resources, more tools for when things happen. We will have so much more innovation and products and creativity. That's essentially the product of freedom and of responsibility. So, if we take this idea of moral and morale to more about individual action and collective action, since that's what it is, the individual action, or the moral action, is typically of raising family, growing food, self-defense, self-healing, work and play, willpower, right? These are individual actions that people can take, and I think they're all really important. But they're not collective action. Some people might see raising food, maybe if it's in a community, as collective action. Well, perhaps, you know, I said that's why community is up here in collective action, because community can combine a lot of these individual actions and bring them together. But that being said, where is the need for collective action? Is there a need for collective action? Well, I would say individual action is all the action that is necessary, okay? And the willpower part plays a huge role. We talked about technology before. Let's think about it. Is technology conscious? Can it ever be conscious? We can give technology a lot of things from our humanity, but can we ever give it consciousness? And there's a lot of movies and video games talking about, well, what if the robots become conscious and they start proclaiming that they have rights and that they have this and that? Well, it's interesting because they're not natural, right? So they aren't like human beings. They can acquire our traits, but they are not to have consciousness, because only human beings can. So something to note, because we typically program robots. We program them, which is a huge word first of all, but we program them to say no. To say yes. They never say no. And human beings have to recognize that their conscious power, their natural intelligence, again, is above the artificial intelligence. We are the ones who create the machines, and we are the ones who can say yes and no, and understand and make choices and evaluate the whole circumstance. Robots may have all this knowledge, which is really essential, as I talk about with you, but they don't have the consciousness to carry out that knowledge and know exactly where to apply it and when, and applying the natural and unnatural, because they are more unnatural than human beings by their very existence, right? And by their very usage. So we need to understand that the natural and the unnatural is a dynamic of human consciousness that we need to understand. And so collective action is having that accountability of all the individuals and things that's going on, and realizing, well, wait, is there a lot of individuals partaking in certain particular individual actions? So a lot of individuals nowadays are partaking in statism, mental slavery. And so the collective action would be to recognize this belief system that's present in so many individuals. And so while you can work with each individual one-on-one, and that can build a really strong relationship with them, you can grow food and have self-defense and self-healing, all this stuff, it can help in the process. There is a greater goal at hand. There is a greater destiny to be achieved, and that is in accountability, in community, and in ultimately abolitionism, which is ending evil. Again, we talked about before the art of no, right? It is one to just say no, and it's another to really get clear and say never, right? Never to all evil. Never let evil grow again. And so that is prevention, and that is mass education, and that is really having rooted principles in the human heart, to where, again, people realize and say, I'm not going to enslave my fellow man, or I'm not going to contribute to slavery. I'm not going to condone slavery. Because you may not want to be treaded upon, but do you want anyone to be treaded upon? Your principles should apply as natural to nature. They should apply universally and timeless. So, the individual action, again, is do the natural, and collective action is manifest the natural. So it's not just sharing the natural, it's manifesting the natural. And that's ultimately how it's shared, right? Is by doing and being the change, and others see that and they say, I want to be like that. You know what? That's a good example of behavior, and it's a behavior that I want to replicate. And children do this at a very young age. They replicate the actions that they see. And so they learn then, over time, what actions are actually beneficial for them versus what isn't. Because just because they're following somebody or following an elder does not mean that that action itself is right or wrong. Right? Just because the elder did it does not make it right or wrong. Just because an authority did it does not make it right or wrong. Just because any person does one particular action does not make it right or wrong. The action itself is what determines if it's right or wrong, because that's how we show ourselves, and that is what manifests into our reality. And that, again, is where we identify the natural and the unnatural effects. So, individual action and collective action, again, let's understand this in an even greater sense. If we are to naturalize ourselves, we attain the natural. And being our natural selves and allowing our natural own environments will naturalize the collective, right? It goes into the collective, it goes into the general public, and that manifests the natural general public, that manifests the natural world. So we manifest naturalization within ourselves, and that allows us easier to naturalize into the world, so the whole world can be naturalized. So the whole world can realize the world that they live in is just the world. It's not under one banner, one flag, or one ideology. It's under simply life, living, human beings. And if they want to use ideologies and politics, just know its time and place. Know it simply should not be imposed upon others. Know it should be used for education and for community work and activism. But nobody should be forced to do something against their will, because that is slavery. So I identified, out of understanding individual and collective action, the 4 only steps to total freedom that I personally have identified. Now, you may see different steps, right? And you may use different methods to get there, but I do see these are the 4 main steps. And I have a presentation that I did a long time ago, which goes deep into 100 other books, going into what it means to change the world, and what have past movements done to change the world. And typically they have all 4 of these steps, okay? Number 1 is usually considered the forgotten step. And this is representation. It's having material or shared symbolism or shared education that allows for step 2, which is the education. So, let's say this flag in the background, this presentation slide, myself. We're representing something more, an idea in particular. Movements are usually based on ideas. This is technically a blueprint for a movement, because if you're representing something and you're saying this is what needs to be cleared and out of the way, so in the case of abolitionism, you're saying slavery is the focus, ending slavery is the focus. You're saying we need to represent and make sure that we make it clear that slavery needs to be abolished, right? And again, whether it's then or now, we still have that to accomplish. So that's why I call myself a modern abolitionist. Now, step 2 is to educate. So from there, and from that title, from myself, from the flag, from the, whatever you're using to represent the education, then is the education, where the individual's looking into it, they understand it, you talk it through, conversation. You can say conversation's all of this, it's the whole step. The only solution is just talking with your fellow man. Instead of the war soldiers going to the middle of the field and saying, all right, we're going to fight each other, they talk first and say, well, is this really a good idea? Should we be doing this? And then they stop fighting. They just go home. They realize they're pawns on the field and they're not there supposed to be fighting each other. They're there supposed to be what? Helping the world, making a better world, not making a worse world. War does not benefit anybody. And guess what? War can actually be completely abolished with the abolition of government, which is what creates all wars. Because you need a systemic system to create systemic slavery or systemic war, systemic evil. You need a system to enable such a systemic anything, okay? So if you don't want evil, which is manifested wrong, get rid of the ability to grow evil, and that is giving people power. And think about it, who is it that seeks power in the first place? It's the people who are psychopaths or want to get away with doing certain bad things. So they use their authority and they use their psychological tricks and they get people on their side to do their bidding because of their insecurities, because of their inner problems that they've never addressed or they don't want to, right? So part of that education you can see is a whole bunch of things, but typically you want it to be rooted in place with the idea that you think is the root cause. And the root cause in this case, as I have identified, is statism. It's order following. Order following is a plague for humanity. That's what it is. And it gives way to all forms of evil. It's people suppressing their nature and therefore literally suppressing nature. It is destroying nature because of the natural authority present within. Your conscience, your own mind is your own self-natural authority, right? But if you shut that down and say, I'm going to follow orders and do what I'm told, where's the natural authority? It's in some man-made artificial authority because they're telling you to do something against your will, against something that you shouldn't do, you still do it. And that is just completely contradictory. I said in the very beginning, we live our lives in contradiction. We're being dishonest, we're being deceived. The number one thing a politician would want a war soldier to do is believe that they're fighting for the right cause. Or the voter to believe that they're voting for the right person, that they're in the right field or camp, the left versus the right, and they pitch them against each other so they can perfectly create a division, so they can create divide and conquer, and get people to do what they want through the Hegelian dialectic, as we talked about before. So this is all part of the education, and you know what? It'll come natural to people as they understand the roots to the problem, which you can get through, the Most Dangerous Superstition book, or Slavery Gone for Good, my book. The reason why we make it books is to make it compact, or Mark Passio's Natural Law Seminar, or this seminar, which is another different perspective. They may have different perspectives on the same knowledge, but it's the same knowledge, it's the same action, it's the same understanding of we need to abolish evil, we need to get rid of this system which has plagued humanity for so long. And it is not doing us any good. This is the only solution. See, movements and a lot of organizations can be easily co-opted. The solution is people just saying no and saying, I'm not going to put up with this, right? And just completely getting out of the systems themselves and then teaching people and creating those alternative systems to show the truth in action. embracing nature as is, as much as possible, and to the fullest extent. So, step 3 is defend. So once you have the education, you know what to do, right? You want to stand on that. So, I use an example. Let's say taxation. A lot of movements in the past talked about taxation. What they did is they said taxation is wrong. We're not going to pay it, right? We're not going to do it anymore. It's a statist act, all right? It's one that supports the state in what they're wanting to do. These gang of people that proclaim to have some sort of authority. So, one town, or many towns, many people come together and say, we're not going to pay this, okay? All they do is defend their ground, stay in place. Gandhi did it with no arms, no, self-defense. But he had so many people on the side, it didn't matter, right? Because if somebody were to use arms against them, they would be making themselves out to be the target. So non-resistance has a huge role to play in this act of truth against violence, because government is a monopoly on violence. And if they're using their own soldiers, their own slaves, which is our own people, to control their own people, it's hypocritical, because they say we're the people, we're the government, but yet we're not allowed to not pay taxes because they will come into our houses and our towns and force us to by violence. Well, doesn't that mean that we're slaves? Doesn't that expose them as they are, as we are trying to portray? So when you have step 1 and step 2 during step 3, the town is defending themselves and they're showing why they're not paying taxes, then the world can see why they're doing what they're doing, and it can replicate the actions, and it will go down in history. So if anything does occur, people will see the willing slaves fighting their fellow man. They will see that there is a government that is literally enforcing slavery by forcing their quote-unquote own people to do what they want for their own will, which is not their own people, and not their own will. If people want to be free, show it. And the best way is to not do any statist act. But once you have enough people together, you build the network up through step 1 and step 2, it makes step 3 a whole lot easier. I would recommend not doing step 3 until you have step 1 and step 2. I'm not inciting violence, I'm inciting defense. People simply living their life. And that's it. And the people who want to stop people from living their own life, shame on you. Shame on you for getting rid of your conscience and getting rid of your humanity. You see humans but no humanity. That's what the order follower does, who tries to stop their fellow man from committing a total peaceful action of literally inaction, doing nothing, not contributing to the system. I mean, how funny is that? A person literally living their life, doing their thing, can be thrown into a cage or enforced and violently imposed upon by their own representative government because they choose what to do with their own product, with their own labor. I mean, this is just insane, right? And so evil exposes itself ultimately, right? Evil exposes itself. The truth does win, but that's because the truth was always here. The truth just is. That is what nature is. So step 4 would be to show and say, hey, we have these signs, we have these flags, we have these materials. This is why we're defending ourselves. This is why we're doing what we're doing, right? And videotape it, have it on camera. Let the times of history know. Let everybody know all you're doing is living your life. And here are these people trying to stop you from living your life. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen. If you're free, you should be able to be free. Live your life so as you choose. You're not harming anybody. You're not creating any victims, right? So what deal do they have, these people with their presumed authority, to go and meddle into your business? You're not free if they have to make you comply to their system. They prove that you are a slave and that you are correct when you say slavery still exists and it needs to end. So, step 1 and step 2 I would consider is more of the individual and moral action. Okay, I say there's networking involved because as you move down this list, it becomes more collective and it becomes the need for morale. You need to gather the courage in order to do step 3, in order to have step 4. You need to know how to use video production, how to use these signs, how to gather people en masse, how to defend yourself and stand your ground. That is a collective and morale action. But the representation and the education is an individual and moral action because each individual heart must be appealed to. Individuals need to learn this knowledge. And it's not going to work if I'm putting out videos. I have to talk to people one-on-one on an individual basis, and I need to encourage you to do the same thing, because that's ultimately how we build connections and get the message out there. You can share this presentation. It can help a lot of people in an individual level, but there needs to first be that incentive and that drive to want to do that in the first place, to click on the video, to watch it, to open the book and then read it. Two separate steps, you know? You gotta buy the book, then open it, and then read it, and then make sure you go back to it. Those are steps that not everybody fully goes through. So it's a process, and understand that it's a process. You have to find a time and place for each person, and understand that the time and place to create change is now. It is now. You should not wait to create freedom. There are solutions of people creating freedom now, and if you have an eye open to see it, you will see it, and you will utilize and say, hey, let's focus on the moral principles of the situation. Let's look at natural and unnatural. Let's look at natural law. Let's look at right and wrong. Because that will instill and make sure that we are on the right path, that we are aligned and we're not getting distracted from what we're trying to achieve. So, really, each one of these steps are connected to each other, and they lead to each other. So if you're on step 2, which is to educate, what are you educating with? Probably step 1. If you're on step 3, which is to defend, what are you defending with? What are you defending for? Probably because of step 2 and because of step 1. These have to be together, and these are the only steps that I see are necessary for total freedom. It is the only way that I see that we attain total freedom, based on what I talked about, and based on understanding the individual and the collective, and how all change operates, and how all movements of the past usually operated to effect a great change in the world. Alright, another way you can look at step 1 and 2 is it's the given and it's the patience. Okay, so we're given knowledge, we're given our nature, and we're being patient, we're learning, we're intuitive, right? Whereas step 3 and step 4 is the giving. So from the given, we're giving, right? So again, you're taking, but you're not stealing. You're taking from the universe, you're taking from yourself, your own energies, you're not stealing, and you're knowing what to take, what actions to take based on that given. So now you can give. And remember, do give, do not steal. This is the idea of naturalizing versus denaturing. You have patience in what you're doing to understand that you know what you're doing, because you need to take the time to understand what you're doing in the first place. And then once you have that time, you have the place. And that place gives you that ambition, okay? You need to know your place, and that's the thing. These people who want to transgress upon you, you tell them, know your place. It's none of my business, okay? And I know my place, that's why I'm not messing with your business. How about that, right? How would you like it if I messed with your business? If I told you that your victimless crime was a crime? If I told you that your non-doing any harm is actually harming people because of this greater good justification that I just pulled out of thin air because I thought so, because of my opinion, because of my whim. So patience and ambition, this is the dynamic to understand. There's a time and place to be patient, and there's a time and place to be ambitious, and we should have both and understand their role in our life. Right? Some people might talk about left brain versus right brain and other different types of polarities. It's all important for sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't use these terms. Real life action defeats censorship. This is crucial to understand, is that if you do a lot of these steps that I talked about and these things, basically you don't need the internet, right? You don't need to be dependent on technology, produce content only on technology, right? You can actually be doing real life action, and if anything, use the technology to benefit the real life action, and censorship is gone. Censorship is not important because you have a real life base and a real life message that is going on its feet, and nobody can stop a real life message except violence, which will try to stop everything because they believe might is right. And you should understand that right is might, as Richard Wetherell said and has a whole book about, because honesty and truth is the truth. You can't undo that. You can't take it out. You can attempt to by making the man-made, by attempting to make the unnatural, but that's why it's unnatural, and that's why it never works, and that's why the man-made is temporary, and that's why what is nature is always showing itself through time as the only answer. You know, again, everybody claims to have the only answer. there's only one answer I can be sure of is the only answer, and that is nature. So if they're claiming they know one, they have some sort of answer that is the only answer, they're claiming to have a basis of nature. They're claiming to know what nature is. And I told you I don't know everything of what nature is. I can't claim to know everything in nature is because I am not nature. We all must actively learn and always learn. The learning process is never finished. What we're trying to do in this life as becoming wise and wise human beings, that's what it means to be a Homo sapien, is to attain that wisdom over time. And it's not one that we just get immediately. It's not one we get from just reading one book. It's one that we have to internally, externally understand. That's what it means to understand, is to look deep into the knowledge. So, protests are not necessary. Offense is counterintuitive. Meetings are not required. All it takes is one town. So many people want to talk about protests, or they want to talk about political actions, right? Let's get this person in office. Let's go in this position. Okay, yeah, let's use the man-made to end this man-made system. That makes a whole lot of sense, right? Well, it depends on the context here. We're talking about the unnatural and natural. For what effect are you trying to create in the world? I will tell you right now, it is extremely counterintuitive to utilize the man-made offices to destroy the man-made offices. You're doing the very thing that you don't want in this world, and you think that you have to somehow transition to that by using that system. You're wrong. You face the problem by embracing the solution. The solution is not participating in that system. You know, again, it's like this whole idea of abolitionism versus immediatism, or, versus gradualism, sorry. Immediatism versus gradualism in the abolitionist period. Oh, well, we can legislate for the end of slavery. We can end slavery over time. We can get there. No, the abolitionists were saying it's wrong, it's immoral, let's get rid of it. That's it. End of story, right? Society will figure out what needs to be done on its own because, again, we are self-organizing, just like everything else in nature. We're not dumb because we aren't supposed to. We're made with the answers in our own nature, just as every other animal and everything else in nature is. It's built to sustain itself. It's built to survive, right? So all it takes is one town doing those actions I mentioned before, and it's not just limited to meetings or not just limited to one thing or another. Representation is a whole bunch of different materials of all different kinds, right? Education can be about a whole bunch of different things. As long as it's rooted on what needs to get done, it just makes the message clearer, so that way the one thing does get done quicker and more manifest, right? But being on the offense is counterintuitive. Why would you go up with arms to the state, right? Which the state inherently is violence. You're treating violence with violence, which is what they do, to prevent problems and claim for the greater good and justifications. And when you use violence, they can easily spin that into a narrative, right? And again, I say they, it's just other human beings who have a control, a monopoly on violence. You don't want to mess with that. Defense is the solution. Standing your ground, being yourself is the solution here. Nature is the answer. Not man, not man-made offices, man-made guns, man-made anything. Simply living your life. Okay? Now you can say representation in these materials, they're forms of man-made things. Sure, right? But what is that representing? Your voice, your conversation, your natural abilities. It's not far from, from your natural abilities. The book is just an organized way of words. It's just an organized speech. It allows your words to be more in order. Okay? So that's all it is. And of course there's some problems with paper reduction and being dependent on that material and such like that. But overall, you can see that as the message to knowledge. Look at the effects. Is it natural or is it unnatural? How is it being used? Not everybody's going to use the book the same way. Again, just because something's natural to exist does not mean it's natural to use. You need to understand the natures at work. Books generally are productive when people read them, and if they use them for the right purposes, or if it's the right books for the right circumstance, right? And they do help a lot of people. Otherwise, people wouldn't be reading books. All right? Be most productive. Create history yourself. And books have been around for quite some time, and I also feel bad for some of the libraries that have burned down in the past because of order followers and people destroying all this great knowledge that's out there. Be most productive, create history yourself. Again, I want you to be your own philosopher. I want you to be your own historian. You are making history right now. You are unique. You are yourself. So there's no reason why you can't be productive by simply being that product of nature itself. You are a product that no other product in the world is like, because only you control your own mind. But the question is, again, do you show it? Do you prove your ownership? Do you prove yourself? And that's what you have to do with this action. I want you to prove yourself. Gather the courage. Become better than me. Look at me and say, I can do better than that. Look at this setup. I can do better than that. And, I got this sphere of influence. I'm going to use that influence. I'm going to do better than that. But I'm going to be conscious as to what I'm doing. It's not a competition. It's not an ego play. I'm not doing this for identity. I'm doing this for humanity. I'm never going to make it about identity. I'm never going to get wrapped in the knowledge or say I know all the answers or that I'm doing something better than anyone else is doing or that I'm going to put myself on a pedestal and I'm this moral human being. No, you're not going to do that. You're going to recognize and sit back and say those things are wrong, and I'm going to know their time and place, and I'm going to draw the line in the sand where it needs to be drawn. I'm going to encourage other leaders, because that's what a natural leader does. Right? I'm going to try to be a natural leader, and I don't have to try. Because the Tao Te Ching tells us, hey, you don't need to try. In fact, actually, by showing and being a change and just living your life, you are showing this natural leader that people will aspire to be. Because the world is rushing around. The world is trying to find answers. And that's often the problem, is why are you looking for it? Why not just embrace it? I said the natural is through the knowledge or the embrace of what is already here, the infinity. And so, respect all peoples. They are still peoples. Even if there's a cop or a politician, doesn't matter. Still think, I can heal this person. This person could be made better. This person still has a conscience, beyond all the barriers, beyond all the illusions. Have faith in their truth. While you reason with them, you can have faith at the same time. Faith and reason can be working together. Just give no heed to evil. Do not allow evil to grow at all, and therefore, if you are giving no heed to evil, you would do your best to promote life. Do not forget about that opposite side. Okay, you would do your best to promote life in your own life and through others. And that's what it means to truly have a stand against evil, because you're against it in all regards. You understand it, and none of us are perfect, right? None of us are perfect. We may have had past that we regret, but it doesn't matter. Tomorrow's a new day. The past is the past. You can't reverse it. You fix your problems. You understand them. You're responsible. You own yourself, and you understand the natures that you're putting into the world. So, again, I will mention, political action is useless. I have a documentary talking a little bit more about this. I would recommend it to the people who are still stuck in this mindset of, well, we can use the political process if we do this and that. Well, if we do this and that. You sound like a statist. You sound like somebody who wants to create slavery. Because you're still saying somebody should be in this position and have more rights than their fellow man. And that we need to beg for permission or we need to ask for change to occur. No, be the change. You don't need to ask or beg for anything. And then you're saying, basically, with wanting political action, that moral action or education is not important. Well, if that's important, then make that the focus. And you say, oh, well, what if we used a campaign for that? Okay, well, then it's a pretty laughable campaign, right? It wouldn't even be a campaign because you wouldn't be electing yourself, you'd be electing the ideas. Put the ideas on a pedestal. You wouldn't put your name on everything and say, elect me, give me money. None of that. You would be saying, okay, let's find opportunities to speak, let's make videos, let's make seminars, let's make brochures, let's get together, let's make a network, let's educate people. But often, I don't see them looking at any of those solutions. They think having the political authority somehow gives them the opportunity to have all their sphere of influence. They contradict themselves. And these are a lot of libertarians or people who claim to care about freedom. And they don't realize that by giving heed to any evil, it only grows more evil and legitimizes the system. We're playing the system. We're still playing the game. And so guess what? You're legitimizing the game. And so they're not really for freedom, because freedom is literally living your life free. And you can create that, and you can find the solutions, and you can work together, and you can educate people, you can do directly what needs to be done, because that is showing and being the change. Did movements of the past rely on politics? Did politics ever get us anywhere good in history? How has it gotten us in the past 300 years? You say, oh, well, it did us good here or there, or, oh, this person won this seat, and you know it did this or that. Guess what? I don't care. Because, again, that still relies on the fact that there needs to be somebody there to give us those permissions to be free, which is the very problem with the world, is the idea that we need permission to be free. Belief of mental slavery. Again, look back in this presentation if you don't understand mental slavery enough. But mental slavery can only be abolished through the mind, which is through education, through knowledge. Moral action, as Aidan Ballou said, is more powerful than political action. So, if I am to break down more as to what we need to do action-wise, because everybody will say, well, we need to be more clear as to what the action is. Okay, well, I'll make it pretty more clear, okay, despite making it really clear as I have so far. The two problems is, number one, not starting, and number two, not going all the way. Okay, so not going all the way is persistence. You need to have persistence in this truth journey. And number one is not starting, so that's courage. So courage and persistence. You need those two things. And if you don't, then those are the two problems. The main problem, of course, is the problem we're trying to tackle, which, again, a problem also means a question, one that requires an answer, so that's going to be the main action. The problem is mass mental enslavement by consent, statism, and belief to unnatural and immoral harmful systems, because they're one and the same, due to the lack, right? Because again, the unnatural can only take from what is natural what already exists. It doesn't create anything new. It only twists what already is. So the main action is the answer to the question that is the problem, and that is awareness of knowledge, or the education of natural law, or nature itself, because that's what natural law means. And rights, which is just morality, right? Understanding what is natural. And the nature thereof, statism, just knowing what statism is in general, which is knowing the unnatural, or the epiphany of the unnatural. Its product, statism, is government. That's what creates the state. Okay, and this is also known as the use of human nature, conscience, sovereignty, responsibility, and the knowledge of nature and of harm manifestations. So you use your nature for nature. You acquire knowledge of nature. Again, the only evil is ignorance. The only good is knowledge. Therefore, that tells you the action and the problem, right? The answer and the problem. Of harm manifestations, well, that would be evil, slavery, democide, tyranny. These things, they're all one and the same and with each other because they're all unnatural. And they're all manifestations because people allow it to grow. They condone it. And so the main action is to prevent that from happening. It's like preventing the disease, preventing the cancer from spreading. You have to identify it. You need to understand it. So your action creates the movement. The movement creates more action. And you can look at movement as sort of moving the mind. Movementus, right? Move the mind. We need to move the minds of the masses so that way they actually start moving in the right direction, in the natural direction. Their minds are actually being used and not turned off or distracted from taking the action that is necessary, which is literally living their own life and doing as they're already doing, minus all the violence, minus all the preconceived notions that contribute to the unnatural manifestations, that contribute to slavery and democide and tyranny, or at the expense of their fellow man. Okay, we're not here to live our lives and ignore that and say, well, other people are suffering, that's their own deal, right? At least I'm not suffering. We're not here supposed to live in ego. We're here supposed to care about everybody that's here, because that is what it means to make a difference in this world. And if you want to make a difference in this world, then I would hope this information is important to you, because we're dealing with the fabrics, the underlying reasons as to why humanity is the way it is. And so the change factors here at play within those 4 steps we talked about before, and within this main action, which is the solution to the problem, is representation, which is creativity, networking, which is guidance, and education, which is the courage. And this is also said as integration and promotion. Promotion, allowing motion, allowing movement. Integration, right? Bringing people together, bringing ideas together. Representation, again, means having shared symbolism, materials, flags, brochures, business cards, what have you, yourself. Networking, bringing people together, bringing the ideas together. Education, that is when you have people together, that is when you have ideas together, that is from the representation. Again, these all connect to each other. And here I have a video talking about what we need to learn about past and present movements, talking a little bit more about these factors and why some of the movements of the past used them. Would be pretty important in case you still want to learn more about that. And another video, why the abolitionists warned us, right? And here's actually a picture of the Liberator newspaper. Again, their motto is, "Our country is the world, our countrymen are all mankind." I even have a summit which has over 30 speakers, which has tons of people who know about slavery and why it occurs on this earth to this day, and how to get rid of it, and a bunch of different solutions and a bunch of different perspectives on the same underlying message to understand that we need to abolish it. And I have a newspaper as well. Again, you can look at the URLs under these photos. It's called the Liberator 2, so I'm bringing back the old Liberator newspaper. At least that's my goal, and that is to bring the idea of modern abolitionism into the play, to show that we need to abolish the systems that be through morality, which again, abolitionism focuses on. But not just moral, but morale, right? So you got nita.one/summit, and then nita.one/newspaper. So that's nita.1/summit, nita.1/newspaper. And I also have a video with a bunch of resources for anybody who's new to content creation. They want to produce content, or they want to share information with people. They want to know what can they represent with, what could they educate with. I have a bunch of resources for people, a whole video dedicated to that. Remember that nature is the answer. And I have a movement that I created to utilize everything I talked about with action and with knowledge, and to make it really clear why nature is important. So I created it for that reason. Let this stand as a test of time. Let this be my contribution to humanity for the rest of time. And I thank you for joining me. I'm going to go over here natural law versus man's law, and where the movement that I created sort of fits in here. Natural law is supposed to be harmonized with due to knowledge and understanding. Well, what is bringing that knowledge? What is allowing that understanding? It's got to be a movement. It's got to be people coming together. Mark Pasio, who even made this slide about natural law and man's law, said that we need numbers of people, and we need to show it, right? There needs to be this quantum shift, as he calls it, that causes this sort of ripple effect in a bunch of people. And so what really shows all those people? A movement, in my view, is necessary. And of course, this movement, since it's talking about nature, is very universal and timeless. I haven't seen any movements like this. It's based upon natural law and free will, both. Okay, not just natural law, but free will as well. You know, whether you talk about free will and think that exists or not is irrelevant to me. If you understand what I mean by this, it's natural law and ourselves, nature and ourselves. That's what it means, okay? It's based on taking what's in from nature and understanding its role within our lives. That's why we say it's the answer, because we are the question. So this movement is inherent to human nature because we created it. And it's bound to us. The answers from nature, the fact that we have to learn from nature, that's bound to us. That's something that we can't get rid of. We always have to learn from nature. And so we do this harmonization with knowledge and understanding through integration and promotion, or representation, education, and networking, as I mentioned before, or the 4 steps that I talked about before. It's voluntarily universal. No one's forcing you by gunpoint to follow this movement, to use its materials, to say this is where you have to share the education. No, it exists and applies anywhere upon human recognition, okay, regardless of location. You can use it literally anywhere. We're not just looking at freeing one part of the world, although it might happen there first. We want to free everybody. I want to get this message out to everybody. I don't care where they're from, because this message belongs with the human species. It belongs to all of humanity. And so if you want to translate this works, feel free. I'm going to provide the slides, all the slides from this presentation, in the description of this video as well, so you can download them, share them on your videos, repost them, whatever, right? And use them to your benefit to share this knowledge. This movement I also created is generational and foundational, so this is all your movement. I didn't create this for myself. I didn't create the website, nita.one, for myself. I created it for you. That's why originally it has nothing to do with me. It doesn't have my name or any of my content on it. And I'm skeptical if I should put this presentation on it, but of course I'm talking about nature. I can't not talk about nature. So it's important that we understand that our role is to be the answer That is, when we are harmonized with nature. Okay, because that allows us to be the representation to the world and say this is the model of humankind, or this is how we want to achieve the future world we want to see. And you don't have to be the model, the beautiful person that says, let's free everybody and I'm perfect and blah, blah, blah. It's not about that. You just want to live your life. And I'm pretty sure most people want to live their life, right? And it doesn't matter. You may have some personal vices or things you're still going through. Don't we all? Right? There's always things we're going through. But we just want each other to live lives that are happy and uninterfered by foreign influences and unnatural influences, things that we would never expect that would happen to us. So the movement is generational and foundational. This can go generation to generation. I create this for everybody, right? People can take this work, they can share it, they can print it. It can always exist regardless of the internet, regardless of the web address, the symbols, the flag, that will always remain so long as people know how to apply it and know to use it, right? It exists and applies since it's human nature, creation, recognition, best unchanged. Of course it would be best unchanged because it amplifies the voice more, it amplifies the ideas more, but I encourage you to take the flag, take the materials and customize it, because again, you are the movement. Just have the knowledge, have the ideas stay very grounded as it is nature itself, otherwise it would be unnatural by definition. So if you want to represent nature, that's literally what the movement is for and trying to do, is to say literally look at the world around you. It is here. It simply asks for your embrace, the liberty of appearing, as we mentioned before. And so while man's law is based on do what I want, natural law says, okay, well, I'm here, I'm going to tell you the effects of man's law, and that's how you understand natural law. And the movement is here to say, well, let's learn about natural law. Let's learn about man's law. Let's learn about both. But let's align to natural law since it is nature. And so the movement, if I'm going to make this even simpler, is you. And natural law, again, is nature. So man's law would be denature, right? It would be the unnatural. And so if you want to be more with nature, the process of is naturalization. And isn't healing easier when you have help, other people with you? Isn't any process easier, pushing a rock up a mountain? Isn't it easier when you have other people with you? So that is the need for a movement and people coming together. Because again, we're a social species. We need to stick together. Just because we're getting rid of authoritative, involuntary hierarchies does not mean we should not have any hierarchies, right? We want to cooperate together. We want to build different structures, and there's always going to be problems. We just don't want them to manifest. We don't want an unnatural world. And so nature is a practice. It requires practice, the same way as you may say medicine is a practice or knowledge is a practice, because these things, again, health is nature, right? Having knowledge is the knowledge of nature. Otherwise, it's deception. It's not knowledge. It's dishonesty. Nature is a practice, one that you have to understand and always practice, because again, the learning never stops. So Naturosophy is a philosophy that will ever grow and expand and ever exist, because we do it every day and people don't even realize it. But when we do it consciously, we understand it even more. We're embracing it. And so it requires practice. And if we say, I'm going to practice this every day, what will happen? You get better at it. I'm going to question this more and more. What's going to happen? You understand it more. And I'm going to find ways to create freedom. You will find more ways to create freedom. You have to practice. Nature is a practice. It requires practice. Practice makes what? Makes perfect. Can you be perfect? No. Can you create a utopia? No. But what's the closest thing to that? Being in alignment with nature, as you so intend by your nature, as everything in nature also tells you to. So abolitionism continues. Time and time again, humanity must get rid of what does not belong. This world gives us messages and warnings, and chaos is the result. It's a teacher of our wrongdoings, of the unnatural world, slavery, right? Tyranny. These things, they teach us to say, we can't deal with this. This is not for the human species. This is not how we're going to survive or evolve or expand into the realm of knowledge. The time for truth is nature's revelation, for people to understand that nature, all it wants is the liberty of appearing, and people need to abide to it, because it ever was here, and it's for all people, regardless of ideology, regardless of politics or whatever. In the same way you may say love is the same thing as nature, but how can you love without nature? See, again, there's also a time and place for love. You can't always love. You need to understand what to do. Nature, as far as I see, is that greatest answer, and humanity needs to get rid of things that go directly against nature, the things that are trying to replace nature, right? That is what does not belong. Governments claiming it's natural to exist, and it's natural to have violence, and it's natural to have mass systemic violence and democide. This cannot continue. And so abolitionism must continue. The abolitionists warned us themselves. And are we just going to ignore them? Are we going to ignore what they said? Here's a chart that sums up everything that we've talked about in Naturosophy. Nature is the law, right? That is natural law. It is the law. It is simply nature, okay? The unnatural version of this is denature. It's law in quotes because it isn't law. What is it? You know? It is just opinions. It's just whims. What people think should be done. But not what they know, because knowledge is also on the left-hand side here, is sapientia naturae, or the nature dynamic. It's understanding our nature and the nature of the world as we see its importance. Whereas if we're ignorant, then we're not seeking knowledge. You know, we're either dishonest, or we don't have enough knowledge, you know, or we're deceiving ourselves or others. And so we don't want to make the wrong appeal. In the case of understanding nature and knowledge, we attain the appeal to nature, which gives us relevance and bias, and then helps us understand that nature is the answer. Yes, we do have a bias. Yes, there is a relevance to nature, because we're bound to it. We can't undo it. Whereas the appeal to nature, to denature, is man is the answer. Man's creation. Let's excuse all the problems. All the problems that happen in nature, well, we can fix that with man's creation. You know? And then all the problems that happen with man's creation, well, we can fix that with more man-made creations. Let's just appeal to denature everything in humankind until we have a man-made system, authoritative system, where man is the authority, and nature can't even be seen by people. They can't even live their own nature. Nature is gone, right? And so what we need to understand is time and place, and not have it disconnected, but have it in unity. Attain alignment, accordance, and temperance, not distraction, which is imbalance or vice, right? Or crimes, right? Which gets even worse later on. Answers. We need to have answers, and that is through the embrace, through the Wu Wei and Zuran, which is the non-doing of the natural. That is what it means to embrace the natural, the nature that is already here, and to not have that answer. What is our answer? What are we answering to? If we're not answering to a natural authority, we're answering to a man-made authority. It is disregarding the natural, and it's all about man-made whims. Again, law, man-made law, their opinions. Somebody told me to do something, I'm going to do it. I'm going to suppress my own internal answers or the world's answers through its knowledge. I don't care about knowledge. I care about what my authority tells me to do. Right? We understand what is natural based upon understanding the answer and the alignments, the appeal to nature, having knowledge and time and place, and that gives us morality. That helps us understand a firm sense of rights, to say that these are parts of our nature. That's what we identify as rights. Whereas it would be unnatural if it's immorality, or we're looking at crimes, you know, crimes that are also excused in the case of slavery, which is non-abolitionism. Abolitionism is through the process of abnegation and apophysis, understanding that there is a time and place for yes and no, both, and that these make a very big difference in our lives. We can't just yes everything or no everything. We need to know to say no as it is due, and when we understand something does not belong, we need to abolish it, right? And conversely, we need to integrate with what does belong, and that is through our morale, our productivism, our practice, our process of understanding what belongs with us, and we can create, we can share, and that is a beautiful world of creativity ultimately, right? Instead of order following, which comes with slavery, which is through statism and non-integration, right? Not working with the world or bringing ideas and knowledge together, but in not, thinking about yourself and what is being given to you. You are just following what is being given to you. And you are not really integrating a lot of the ideas into your life. You're not abolishing or saying it's clear you have a direction and a purpose and a destiny in this life. You are just following someone else's destiny, someone else's purpose. And you're pretty much unclear of what is your own, or you're deceived into thinking that something is your own until you realize it really isn't. And so, what we have is naturalization. And when you're on the right path and you're toward alignment, and through abolitionism, integration, what is natural, the answer, and alignment, time and place, appeal to nature, what is knowledge, you attain naturalization, which is the process of nurturing and attaining progress, not regress. Because regress would result in regret, which is denaturalization, where we become less of nature, where we become less of who we are meant to be. So we ever are striving to find our purpose, our destiny, and that is the goal of humanity. That's the whole reason why we need to evolve, and this philosophy stands for the test of time so we can do that. I want you to practice Naturosophy, use my works for any purpose of yours. Libraries may print and showcase my works. And to learn more, I would encourage you to look at my published guidebook, or my own published journal writings. This is to come, and I encourage you to look into it when it is out. All of this work is based on my second book, Sapientia Naturae, which you can find at nita.one/wisdom. And it is rather more lengthy than the Slavery Gone for Good book, because it's meant to be more of a thinking, reflecting, intuitive process of reading. So do not forget, this is my main message here, do not forget, it's not about morality. It's not just about morality. It's about our very being, our very ability to have morality, the nature for the nature, the ability to do what is natural, not just what is natural. You don't see the sky if you are looking at it through a screen. You want to see and live and breathe reality. You don't want to breathe toxins, live in toxins. If you ever find yourself lonely, know that you are never alone. You have the natural world to your disposal. The natural world is all around you. You can use it to your benefit, and you can benefit others at the same time. It all relies on your conscious action. So thank you very much for watching this presentation. I appreciate your time, your energy, your patience upon this knowledge. I thank you for you, who you are deep down underneath, inside. And I love you as a human being. I want to see you prosper. I want to see the world prosper. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made this. I don't make this with donations in mind. I don't make this with money in mind. The movement has nothing to do with it. My works have nothing to do with it. Everything I do is for education and for changing the world and the minds and hearts of people, because that is what matters in this world. And I would hope you agree with that, because, frankly, what we're missing in this world is our humanity, that ability, that love, that heart, that care for our fellow humankind. And so that is what I'm going to manifest, and by manifest I mean I'm going to put it into action. I'm going to do everything I can to make the truth be the truth. I don't have to make it, I have to embrace it. By making, I'm really just embracing. So I encourage you to do the same. Think about the world that's around you. Thank the others around you for bringing you to who you are, right? Be grateful in this process, and understand the time and place to be grateful, and understand the time and place to hold them accountable and say, well, have you ever questioned this or that, right? Ask questions. Get very curious. Have an open mind. High mileage questions. Get the conversation going. I thank you very much for watching this presentation. All I want is for that conversation to start going in humanity, and for us to actually commit to actions that will produce productive results for humanity. That's why I made this. I appreciate you for watching. Take care. Nature is the answer. Cory Edmund Endrulat. We will prevail.